Chapter 5:24. Sealed in the chest of every Kiru was a heart stolen from a mortal, allowing these greater devils to make decisions without being affected by their emotions. However, the Kiru that was the enemy of the Pit Fiend General was clearly even crazier. In pursuit of power and revenge, he didn't care about his own death. He used a drop of Zeus Ker's blood to replace the mortal heart he originally needed, sealing it in his chest. This Kiru had actually managed to survive, and obtained great power. After all, Zeus Ker was a divine abomination, an unforeseen product of divine power that shouldn't have existed. They were either descendants of gods who had died young, absorbing power from the twisted pain of their parents, or they were failed creations created by gods, and mortals as well, through divine power. There were countless types of divine abominations. They were cursed by heaven, hell, and even the bottomless abyss. Most of them were firmly sealed by the gods the moment they were born. However, with the passage of time, there were times when divine abominations would be accidentally released, or break free of their cages. Normally, divine abominations that escaped would hide in a material plane. Due to their twisted nature, they would plan and carry out great terror that could endanger the entire world, taking pleasure in it. As most divine abominations ignited the spark of divinity, they couldn't be easily killed. Even if a god wanted to correct their mistakes, they would have to pay a price that they couldn't bear. Hence, when a divine abomination descended upon a material plane, the gods or powerful legendary wizards of that world would rarely think of ways to kill it. Instead, they would do their best to drive it away or seal it away. Divine abominations had their own ways of contending against them. If the material plane was very interesting and attractive to the divine abomination, they would strip themselves of their essence and form divine abomination's blood, randomly hiding it in a corner of that world. Afterwards, even if the divine abomination was driven away or sealed away, it would still have the chance to return to that world. The hidden divine abomination's blood was like a beacon, guiding the divine abomination's direction. The Kiru had coincidentally found a drop of Zeus Ker's blood when conquering a material plane. As Zeus Ker was a divine abomination born from a god with a domain of frost and ice, it was compatible with the Kiru. That was why he had decisively sealed it in his chest to increase his own strength. Madness is hidden within reason, Keyes thought to himself after hearing the Pit Fiend's account, truly a ruthless character. Long before subduing the Pit Fiend General, the young blue dragon had received a report from Kryphia. She said that a white dragon had led a few strong white dragons to reject the recruitment of the Megalosaurus army. When she'd led the dragons to punish them, she'd discovered that the white dragons were serving a general. When she'd approached the fort, she'd sensed some obscure divinity. After all, she's SSSSSSSS. However, she'd never thought that the master of Fort Bator would have such a terrifying treasure as the divine abomination's blood. This is a hidden danger, Keyes pondered. His interest in the divine abomination's blood piqued, but it's also an opportunity. However, he wasn't planning on using his active adaptation ability. The risk of absorbing the divine abomination's blood wasn't proportional to the benefit. Keyes was thinking of another way to use the divine abomination's blood. Worm Lord, Minotaur King, Pygmy God. I wonder if you'll mind if I give you a big gift? Just as Keyes was pondering, New Boomtown gradually approached the Kiru's fort. Seeing such a huge creature approaching, the enemy's patrol team didn't hesitate at all, turning to flee in the direction of the fort. Keyes walked to the balcony of the audience room. This was the highest point in New Boomtown, and he could easily observe the scenery outside the city. Taking a deep breath of the cold air, he turned to ask the kneeling Pit Fiend General, "How should I address that fellow? It's a little rude not to know the master's name. He's called Fells, his real name. When I sent him to the death camp, I automatically lost control of it." The Pit Fiend's head drooped even lower. His nickname is Frostblood Storm. Keyes nodded, the corners of his mouth curling into a smile as he spoke slowly in a casual tone. "We're old acquaintances. Why don't you go and greet him first? This subordinate will definitely not be rude. Rest assured, my lord." The pit fiend raised his head as he spoke, his lips curling into a sinister smile. Because it had sealed Zeus Kerr's blood, the Kiru devil was constantly emitting a cold aura to the surroundings. Wherever he was, even if there was a super-efficient refrigerator installed, the environment would be greatly affected. The ground beneath Traction City was covered in a layer of ice that was 2 to 3 feet thick. Huge tracks would creak as they moved. To prevent the tracks from slipping, Shea, who was in charge of maintaining the machinery, had temporarily added 2 ice wheels to Traction City. Like a huge wheel saw, it descended from the back of Traction City and touched the frozen ground. Driven by gears and chains, the wheel spun quickly, its sharp teeth scraping against the ice. Not only did it increase its stability, it also provided additional support for Traction City. Hordes of barbed fiends brought along even more imps and laborers as they busied themselves in New Boom Town. They inspected every mechanical component and applied anti-freezing ointment. As the person Keyes had personally chosen to greet, the pit fiend general immediately spread his wings and rose into the sky after receiving the order. The hot air from his nostrils and mouth formed a white mist that was several feet long. Hellfire rain. As the pit fiends could only use meteor burst once a day, and he'd already used it once before, he could only use another method to greet. Following the activation of his spell-like ability, the skies of Acid Fog Canyon turned red in an instant, as if it had been scorched by fire. Sporadic flames began to gush out from the clouds and slowly fell towards the Kiru demon fort. Moreover, it seemed to be growing more and more intense. Because he didn't want to be rude, the pit fiend general had cast the spell with the greatest amplitude he could achieve. For a short period of time, the skies of Acid Fog Canyon seemed to turn into Avernus, where rain of fire would pour down. The blazing flames with the smell of sulfur were like a torrential downpour, falling straight towards the Kiru stronghold. The buildings made of solid ice immediately became full of holes. Chapter 525. To be honest, the devil guards of Kirumo's stronghold didn't feel any fear in the face of hellfire rain. On the contrary, they felt a sense of familiarity. Batsu Devil didn't fear fire damage. Apart from a few special flames, the rest only made them feel warm and comfortable. That's right, warm and comfortable. Although it wasn't a problem for them to survive in an extremely cold environment with their strong physique, few devils truly liked it. Kirumo devils, especially Felt, who had sealed a drop of Batsu's blood, were an exception to the rule of the Batsu devil race. He loved the cold. The biting cold wind made his mind sharper, while the solid ice made him feel powerful and at ease. Therefore, when the stronghold made of solid ice became full of holes after being hit by hellfire rain, his anger burst forth instantly. In the core area of the stronghold, the bone-piercing cold caused the devil guards on duty to shiver. However, they didn't dare speak out despite their anger. Holding a spear made of Kania's ice, this Commander Kirumo devil used a high-level teleportation and immediately arrived at the top of the stronghold. Ice Dome. As he waved the ice spear in his hand, the air above the stronghold gradually froze, forming a hemispherical dome of ice. Flames landed on the dome of ice and sizzled. In an instant, steam rose, as if covering the stronghold with a hazy veil. Immediately afterwards, Frost Blood Storm pointed at Traction City that was sailing towards the stronghold from afar. He used his strong insect jaw to chant an incantation. Ice Comet. 3 ice crystal seeds suddenly formed in the atmosphere of the Acid Fog Canyon. Guided by the spell, they rapidly fell. As they fell, the ice crystal seeds condensed even more water vapor, causing their volume to slowly increase. By the time they appeared above Traction City, the 3 ice comets were close to 10 feet in diameter, exceeding the height of 2 humans combined. Due to the effects of gravity, the ice comets had terrifying kinetic energy. They would instantly explode upon collision, turning into sharp ice shards that would shoot in all directions, tearing apart the flesh of the enemy. 3 of these ice comets formed a line, their target being the top of the tower where Keyes was in the audience room. Not bad, its power is comparable to meteor burst. Standing on the balcony, Keyes looked at the incoming ice comet and nodded. However, Keyes remained where he was. Traction City had anti-air defenses, and he was not in a position to intervene in such a small matter. When the ice comet appeared, Fury cannons immediately locked onto it. These ballistic cannons were all provided by Shea, and they were usually hidden in the shadows of the top of the Traction City. They would only be activated when there was an air raid, fulfilling their mission. They were powered by spells and automatically aimed at the incoming spells, creatures, or summons. Different crossbow bolts could be used to target different targets to maximize the interception effect. For example, when intercepting the ice comet, when the automatic ballista identified the target, it immediately replaced the bolts with impact oil. After locking on to the target, it also added guidance spell before firing. Dozens of ballista cannons aimed and fired at the same time. All the arrows were aimed at the 3 ice comets, and the number of arrows was roughly the same for each of them. The arrows, as thick as an arm, were like a dense swarm of bees as they flew towards the ice comets with a hum, hitting their targets with unerring accuracy. Bang, bang, bang explosions rang out one after another. When the arrows with impact oil hit the ice comets, they would immediately expand and explode from the impact. It was like fireworks, and the 3 ice comets exploded in the air. Thousands of sparkling ice crystals shot out in all directions. It looked beautiful, but danger lurked everywhere. Every ice crystal was like a sharp dagger. Fortunately, the guards and citizens of Traction City had already taken shelter in the buildings. Thus, apart from a few damaged outer walls, there were no casualties. Be sincere in your greetings. Keyes's words suddenly rang in the ears of the Pit Fiend General, causing him to shudder for no reason. He thought for a moment and gritted his teeth, using a spell to send a message to his 2 subordinates. Come to my side now. Receiving the order from their superior, the 2 centaurs glanced at each other and immediately used a greater teleportation spell to rush to their superior's side. Today is your lucky day. Keep your spirits up and greet that Kiru demon with all your heart. Saying this, the Pit Fiend General's hands lit up with flames. He reached out and grabbed the 2 centaurs. Devil molding! 2 balls of fire instantly entered the 2 centaurs' bodies with the life essence of the Pit Fiend General. Blood gushed out from their pores, condensing into 2 blood cocoons. Roughly a minute later, the 2 blood cocoons broke apart at the same time. 2 young pit fiends were born into the world at this moment. In order to evolve into a unique pit fiend, the Pit Fiend General had accumulated a long time ago. He had just used up a quarter of his strength. If not for Keyes forcing him, he would never have chosen to use devil molding to forcefully help his subordinates advance. Do you have any objections to my words? Due to the exhaustion of his strength, the Pit Fiend General panted heavily as he berated the 2 youths of his race. Of course not, my lord. How would I dare go against my lord's orders? Their heads shook like rattles, the 2 young pit fiends first expressing their loyalty before starting to work hard. Meteor burst! Meteor burst! They used the most shocking greeting method. They directly used their spell-like abilities to summon Meteor Burst, and blasted it at the Kairu Demon Fortress under their feet. Moreover, it was a giveaway. Felt's compound eyes almost popped out of their sockets. Since when had the Pit Fiend General become so generous? He was actually willing to use devil molding on his subordinates, and to promote them to pit fiends at that. Moreover, he was promoting 2 centaurs at once. Gather outside the stronghold. Of course, he wasn't blinded by jealousy. Seeing the 2 meteor bursts heading towards the icy stronghold, he immediately ordered all his subordinates to retreat. However, His order wasn't to all retreat, but to gather outside the stronghold. Having promoted 2 centaurs at the same time, Felt didn't believe that the pit fiend general hadn't suffered any losses. Now was the best time for him to take revenge. As for the 2 young pit fiends, he really didn't care about them at all. In fact, after sealing Zeus Kerr's blood, Felt's strength was far greater than before. Pit fiends that had advanced through devil molding could only be considered the weakest of the pit fiends. As long as Felt was willing to pay a price and borrow more strength from Zeus Kerr, he really did have a chance of killing these 3 pit fiends. Chapter 526. Other than borrowing the power of Zeus Kerr, Filt Frostbloodstorm actually had some other trump cards. In his army there were 5 or 6 white dragons, over 100 frost giant warriors, and 30 ice golems. If used properly, this power could even be used to conquer a mortal kingdom without causing too much damage. Therefore, even though Filt was chased out of Frostblood Fortress by the meteor storm, he did not choose to retreat immediately. Extreme Frost Snow Region. His pair of insect claw-like arms waved, drawing a series of abstruse trajectories. Then, he began to chant an incantation. As he chanted, which sounded like the gnawing of insects, mixed with a clear creaking sound, the biting cold wind began to blow in all directions. The storm carried snowflakes that condensed out of thin air. It was as if it wanted to fill up the entire world, completely burying and freezing everything. Soil, air, gravel. Everything was covered in a layer of frost and snow, and it was still getting thicker and deeper. Due to the characteristics of the acid fog canyon, the condensed snowflakes were not of the normal white color. Instead, they had a touch of a demonic color. Blood-red patterns extended from Filt's chest to his limbs. In order to strengthen the spell, he borrowed the power of Zeus Kerr. Let me in and freeze everything. Now is not the time. Zeus Kerr's voice suddenly sounded in Kira's heart. This devil instinctively rejected the abomination of Frost's suggestion. Silence. It was as if everything was still. The abomination stopped its temptation. However, not only did it not stop helping Filt, it even gave him more power. As long as the frost and snow continued, he still had a chance. When Kira was unable to control the blizzard, Zeus Kerr would be able to descend on his own. It would not be too late to settle the score with him then. As the blizzard continued, a thick blanket of snow appeared on the path of the traction fortress. The tracks would sink into it if they pressed on it. This moving fortress had to stop temporarily to deal with the various mechanical problems caused by the cold wind and snow. After completing the entire spellcasting process, Felt Ice Storm leaned on the Carnia ice spear and panted heavily. Even with Zeus Kerr's help, he was still very tired after hastily releasing a legendary-level spell. Attack and occupy that fortress! My soldiers, go fight, go plunder, and send cold death to your opponents! Filt roared loudly. He pointed at the traction fortress in the distance and ordered his troops to attack. The soldiers of the Batsu people were still fine. Most of them were shivering from the cold and did not feel too excited. However, the frost giants were happy to endure the cold. As giants who lived with ice and snow, they had blue skin like glaciers. Their hair and beards were either light white or light blue, with frost and icicles mixed within. The cold only made Frost Storm their spirits were high. In particular, when they heard words like battle and plunder, these brutal warriors instantly roared in excitement. Frost Storm, Frost Storm, Frost Storm, Frostwind Fortress, Frost Storm, Frost Storm, Frost Storm, Frost Storm, Frost Storm, Frost Storm, Frost Storm. They wore armor sewn from shields, which clanked as they ran. Their feet were thick and wide, so that they wouldn't sink into the snow or slip. They carried huge axes in their hands and grappling ropes around their waists. Kairu's subordinate, the Batsu Devil, followed closely behind, craftily using the frost giants as the vanguard and as a protective barrier. Fels did not follow behind the army. The 30 ice demon statues surrounded and protected him. They were on guard against their opponents in the sky. After all, there were still 3 pit fiends there. "Kill that Kirug for me!" the pit fiend general roared. "Punish this traitor who doesn't follow the path of rank." Holding a long whip made of hellfire in his hand, he whipped the 2 newly promoted subordinates while giving the order. Under the pressure of their superior, the 2 young pit fiends burst into flames as well, folding their wings and diving towards the ground. Just in time. His compound eyes caught the enemy's trajectory, and Kirug's insect jaws opened wide as he gripped Kanya's icy spear even tighter. Ice demon statues, get into formation and receive the enemy. 5 ice demon statues obeyed the order and ran to Fell's side. They placed their arms with sharp icicles together. Asterisk bang, bang. Asterisk 2 consecutive explosions rang out as the pit fiends descended from the sky, brandishing their flaming greatswords as they smashed into the arms of the ice demon statues. Because they were supporting each other, the ice demon statues were only damaged. They weren't destroyed by the pit fiends' monstrous strength. After enduring the first wave of attacks, the ice demon statues immediately displayed their defensive and offensive techniques, launching a large-scale attack. Fells had already used a teleportation spell to leave the moment the collision occurred, leaving behind only an afterimage. The pit fiend general had wanted to use his 2 subordinates as cover to launch a sneak attack, but his blade only pierced through the air. Greater strike demon statue. Now that he'd exposed himself, the pit fiend general no longer concealed himself. He directly threw a special spell at the ice demon statue that was attacking him. The elemental essences that had been imprisoned within the ice demon statue appeared in his hands in an instant, and were burned to nothingness by hellfire. The other 2 young pit fiends had only just advanced, so they couldn't grasp such an unorthodox technique like the general. They could only use spells like Scorching Ray to cut through the body of the ice demon statue, and then attack its core. To be honest, 3 pit fiends against 30 ice demon statues was a little troublesome, but the outcome was already decided. However, how could Fells not know this? In fact, he'd already made special arrangements to trick his opponent. Roar! Just as the 2 pit fiends were about to destroy another ice demon statue, something unexpected happened. A large head suddenly emerged from the shattered body of the ice demon statue, and viciously bit the 2 pit fiends. It was an old white dragon. Its teeth were tainted with poison, and as it bit down, it spat out a breath. Although the 2 young pit fiends used their greater strength to break free from the bite, they were still injured. Their bodies were covered in wounds from the dragon's teeth. Because the old white dragon's teeth had been tainted with frostbite's poison, faint red crystals of ice began to condense in their blood. Not long after, the 2 pit fiends died. Chapter 527. The pit fiend general felt his heart ache. It wasn't because of his subordinate's death, but because he'd lost his strength for nothing. "You piece of trash!" Hellfire shot out from his hands, instantly engulfing the 2 ice golems in front of him and turning them into boiling steam. Whoosh! Using the steam as cover, Fate quietly appeared behind the pit fiend general, and Kanya's icy spear shot out. However, just like how he could use illusions, this pit fiend general was also an expert at using illusions in battle. The icy spear only pierced through the air, but it wasn't easy to pull it back. It was tightly gripped in someone's hand. Command, intimidate! Hellfire breath. The pit fiend general laughed maliciously, using a command spell on Fate before spitting out hellfire from his mouth. The flames from Nessus of the Ninth Hell were no ordinary flame attack. They weren't something the Batsu devil was immune to. When they came into contact with Kiru, who was in a state of intimidate, the evil flames began to invade his body without mercy. It was like pouring a basin of cold water into hot oil. With a series of crackling sounds, Fate's chest suddenly exploded. The chitin breastplate that looked like an insect's first shattered under the burning of the hellfire, then shot out. Die, you lowly worm! At the same time, A giant sword formed from hellfire appeared in the Pit Fiend General's hand, and he viciously slashed it towards Fate's head. If he was hit by this natural momentum slash, Kirumo's skull would definitely be split open, and he would most likely die. Zeke's Kur, lend me your strength. Fate's insect jaw spat out blood-red ice crystals, wanting to borrow a portion of the divine abomination's strength to turn the situation around. However, before the abomination, who was far away, could agree, he suddenly felt an intense pain in his chest. A strong palm pierced through the shell ravaged by hellfire, piercing into Fate's chest where he'd sealed the blood of the divine abomination. He grabbed Zeus Kur's blood with his hand and pulled it out of Kiru Demon's body. Courtesy demands reciprocity. Since I sent someone to greet you, you naturally have to prepare something in return. This drop of blood is not bad, thank you. With a cold smile on his face, Keys sized up the return gift in his hand. He didn't even glance at Kirumo, who was lying on the ground. Seeing the young blue dragon appear out of nowhere, the giant sword in the Pit Fiend General's hand dissipated. My lord, once we're done here, we're about to set off. As if responding to Keys's words, the distant Traction City sounded its horn. That was the sound of the engine starting again. The frost giants who were rushing towards the mobile stronghold were shocked to find that the jagged gate of the stronghold was slowly opening. With the ogre Neru as their leader, the warriors roared and charged out with an aura no weaker than the frost giants. Neru's face was brimming with a satisfied smile. Key's words have always been reliable. I'll definitely have enough battles to fight. I won't feel bored anymore. After gathering another batch of prisoners, including 100 or so frost giants that had been knocked unconscious, as well as a few more devil guards, Traction City started moving towards its next target. After being greeted by the 2 meteors of the Pit Fiends, there was no need to gather the remaining resources in the icy stronghold. This saved them some time, as time was of the essence. Ever since they'd obtained Zeus Kur's blood, Keys and the Demolic Snade hadn't left the magic laboratory. They'd been conducting all sorts of experiments on the blood of the Divine Bastard. The abilities of the Divine Bastard are truly peculiar. Looking at the ball of blood on the experiment table, Keys couldn't help but sigh. Snade, who was beside him, nodded in agreement. When he'd obtained it, the young blue dragon had felt a strong connection with him. The other party had constantly tried to use words to promise him all sorts of benefits, with the goal of enticing him to listen to orders and create a suitable opportunity for him to descend. However, these so-called promises didn't have much of an enticement for Keys. After all, with his current strength, he wouldn't be too afraid to face a weak god. At most, he wouldn't be able to defeat them, but escaping unscathed shouldn't be a problem. However, the power of a divine bastard, especially one as weak as Zeus Kur, was at most on par with a weak god. Moreover, there was a high probability that it would be slightly weaker. However, it was able to ignore Stim's seal and extend its will into the acid fog canyon. This was what truly surprised Keys. That was why he'd feigned civility. On one hand, he'd pretended to be bewitched by it, and on the other, he'd carefully studied the characteristics of the Divine Bastard. After 2 days of experiments, he'd already confirmed that Zeus Kur had a way to transfer its will and even part of its power across planes into the blood of the Divine Bastard that it had separated. This laboratory that was about to be destroyed by the low temperature was the best proof. They're not gods, but they have characteristics similar to gods. Their bodies and wills are highly integrated and unified. Before Stim sealed the plane, this drop of Divine Bastard's blood had already arrived at the Acid Fog Canyon along with Kiru Demon. Therefore, his will wasn't driven away. Instead, it was recognized as a local resident of the Acid Fog Canyon along with this drop of blood. Divine Bastards probably don't have the ability to create avatars. They can't project their will like gods. The so-called blood of the Divine Bastard is actually a half-finished avatar. As long as all of its power is transferred, this drop of divine bastard's blood will become a real divine bastard, and the original divine bastard will be transformed into the blood of the divine bastard. The descent of the divine bastard is actually a transfer of the original body. After having a general understanding of the characteristics of the divine bastard, Keyes also made a bold guess as to why Zeus Kerr hadn't descended previously. It was obvious that the divine bastard was a divine creature that was very similar to God's. However, they didn't have a clergy, so they wouldn't and couldn't fulfill the obligations that those powerful forces had to abide by. In order to rationalize their existence, the divine bastard would usually set their goals as slaughtering gods or destroying all living things. The former was the goal of the more powerful divine bastards. After they put it into practice, it was to replace them. The latter, on the other hand, was the only choice for the divine bastards that didn't have the ability to slaughter gods. They had to persevere. If they wanted to survive, they had to make their lives meaningful. However, the plane of the acid fog canyon was not a material plane. Most of the living things here were demons and devils. The souls of creatures from the lower realm, like the destruction of life, weren't very attractive to the divine bastards. This was because even if those fallen lives were killed, they would most likely be resurrected in the bottomless abyss or the 9 prisons of Bader. Unless the divine bastard was willing to spend more power to completely annihilate them. However, the gains didn't make up for the losses. Chapter 5:28. Abominations were not ancient evil creatures. They were the creations of the gods. Although they did not have divinity or priesthood, they still ignited the spark of divinity and had to abide by the rules of the multiverse. To survive, the gods had to fulfill the obligations of their priesthood, because that was the important meaning of their existence. Their actions had to conform to their priesthood, and they had to achieve the maximum effect of their priesthood with the smallest cost. Abominations were similar. When they chose to prove the meaning of their existence, they also had to consider the ratio of investment and output. Creatures of the Nirvana underworld, under the situation of investing the same amount of energy, would be far less than the Nirvana underworld. That was why Zeus Kerr did not forcibly enter the acid fog canyon through the connection of the abomination's blood to prove himself. It was not that he could not do it, but the acid fog canyon was not very tempting to him for the time being. It was just a battlefield for the demons. If I sense that there are enough mortals, and they are the kind with strong vitality, will it attract the abominations? Keyes pondered. In his mind, a somewhat crazy idea gradually took shape, and the details of the operation were quickly perfected. In the vast acid fog canyon, if one were to talk about the number of lower world creatures, it would definitely be the otherworldly mercenaries under Kitha's command. However, the young blue dragon had no intention of sacrificing them, at least not for the time being, because he had other options. Kryphia had gathered the Megalosaurus army and found out an important piece of information, and it was basically consistent with what Graz ZT had said before. The Tauran king had made a comeback this time, and did not seem to be leading an army of demons. Instead, he had brought many half-demon Taurans. In theory, half-demons or half-purgatory creatures could not be considered as pure demons of the underworld. Although they had similar abilities and temperaments, their bodies and souls were not fused as one like real evil demons. If they were killed, the souls of the half-demon Taurans would most likely enter the kingdom of Buffett, just like the mortals with faith. Zeus Kerr should have a lot of interest in destroying such creatures, and he might be able to lure them to successfully descend. I still need to experiment first. After suffering a great loss last time, Buffett probably won't come alone to provoke me again. Keyes made up his mind. As long as I encounter a half-demon minotaur, I'll immediately capture it and sacrifice it to see how the abomination reacts. Having thought this through, the young blue dragon looked at the blood of the bastard god on the experiment table in front of him with a smile. You'll definitely enjoy a delicious feast, and there will be desserts before the meal. You won't be disappointed. That's what I said. Then, Keyes looked at Sneyd, who was next to him. The two looked at each other and began to prepare to cast spells together. After all, the abomination's blood was a very dangerous item. Now that it was in Traction City, he had to have a backup plan. Mysterious incantations were chanted by the two powerful spellcasters, and the temperature in the cold laboratory suddenly rose. The ice shell on the experiment table began to melt. 4 holes opened at the 4 corners of the table, and 4 chains shot out from them. Shadow cage. Phase anchor. The 4 chains intertwined and wrapped around the abomination's blood, putting a layer of shackles on it. These chains were the spoils of war that Keyes had obtained previously. They were attached to the chain demon general who wanted to evolve into an evil demon. They had the ability to communicate with the shadow plane. Although this ability was restricted in the current acid fog canyon, it wasn't too much of a problem to link with the shadows of objects. If Zeus Kerr's blood suddenly erupted, the most troublesome threat would be the severe cold around him that could freeze everything. Ordinary mortals couldn't resist it. Even if he didn't initiate an attack, the severe cold that he involuntarily emitted could freeze a mortal into a block of ice within a few breaths. However, with this shackle, when the ice abomination suddenly erupted, its influence would first be transferred to the shadows outside Traction City. Although this was only a temporary measure that could at most transfer the center of the ice from inside the city to outside the city, this distance couldn't be underestimated. As long as he was prepared, he could activate the lock, or let the heating system of Traction City operate. This could reduce casualties. After doing all this, Keyes still didn't leave the laboratory. Instead, he let the half-lich Sneyd handle his work. After all, Zeus Kerr had sent him many temptations through the abomination's blood. If it were someone else guarding it, there would be problems. As for the daily work arrangements of New Boomtown, Keyes didn't have to worry too much with his own partners managing it. Thus, Bador City followed the original plan and quickly nibbled away at the scattered bastions of Bador. The intestine of the city wasn't idle for even a moment. Often, just as it finished digesting the resources of a fortress, another fortress would be devoured by Traction City. In order to increase work efficiency, Shay of the Wizard clan set up a temporary workshop to produce construct creatures for work. The ogre shaman and half-goat apothecary were similarly busy. They worked day and night to make vitality ointment for the soldiers who took turns to participate in the battle, as well as the laborers who worked hard. In this way, New Boomtown gathered the forces of the original Bador Expeditionary Army while methodically approaching the Broken Canyon. Due to the super-high efficiency of this mobile fortress, the running away from the poison rule set by Stim gradually lost its effect. According to Stim's rules, the Helminth Tyrant, which wanted to break through the various Bador fortresses one by one, ended up in the awkward situation of raising a tide of worms but not being able to find a target. All that was left for the worms were the devastated ruins of the fortress, as well as the deep trenches left behind by Traction City's caterpillar track. The impatient worm demons couldn't find a target to vent their desire for slaughter, and they even had many internal conflicts. If not for the presence of the Helminth Tyrant, these gathered demons would have brought great casualties to their own side. This strange phenomenon quickly spread to the Broken Canyon. The dwarf deity and the Tauren king received the news almost at the same time. Bafemont immediately flew into a rage. He accused Stim of setting the Bullsh*T rules of the game and repeatedly asked for the initiative to attack. But the dwarf deity still couldn't make up his mind. He was the god of virtual games, and had to fulfill the responsibilities given by his clergy. And for any game, it was a taboo for the publisher and producer to constantly adjust the basic rules. But his reasons couldn't convince Bafemont at all. Your problem is your own problem. The Tauren king expressed that it had nothing to do with him. He only needed to wash away his shame. Dwarf bastard, I'll ask you one last time. Are you going to let my army attack, and at the same time, give me the authority to command the worms? Bafemont stood at the entrance of the army camp with a machete in his hand. He looked at the dwarf deity in front of him with an unfriendly gaze as he spoke, gritting his teeth. Chapter 529. This gigantic devil was covered in crimson scales, and a pair of large bat-like wings extended from his back. Green venom dripped from his mouth, landing on the ground and stirring up clouds of smoke. On his waist there was a belt with 12 screaming angel heads hanging from it. Without a doubt, these heads were the spoils of war he had cut off with a flaming greatsword in his claw-like hands. He was Bardi, the temporary lord of the first layer of Bator, Avernus. He was a rising star in the 9 hells of Bator. Though he looked ferocious on the outside, Bayer was quick-witted and resourceful. He was adept at betrayal, and ambush. Using his sharp mind, he was always one step ahead of his opponent. The other 8 lords of the 9 prisons of Bator had taken a liking to Bayer's strengths. Though they were unwilling to form an alliance with him, they had never stopped plotting against him. That was why they had agreed to let him take charge of the front lines of the blood war. Bayer knew the meaning of his existence, so he worked hard every day. He spent most of his time on the blood war against the bottomless abyss, constantly patrolling the defenses and formulating battle strategies. All of this left him racking his brains, even forgetting to eat and sleep. To be honest, he was doing well. However, that was only so far. In fact, he was facing a thorny problem. The expeditionary army of Bator that had been sent to the Acid Fog Canyon to participate in the crusade against the tyrant worm had lost contact with the rear. The 9 purgatories below. Standing in front of the cursed bone gate, Bayer rubbed his eyes with his coarse fingers to soothe his agitated emotions. Though he was still under the protection of centaurs and pit fiends, he did not feel safe at all. He knew his own value, and he also knew that he had no right or opportunity to fail. If he failed in the blood war, even if it was just a small problem on the battlefield, he would lose the trust of Nessus. Without the support of the Astamors, what awaited him would be a fate countless times more tragic than death. "You bunch of lowly demons," Bayer roared, his corrosive saliva splashing everywhere. Smoke rose from the bodies of the devil guards around him, but they did not dare to make a sound. "How long do we have to wait before we can reconnect to the Acid Fog Canyon?" 2 pit fiends who were proficient in spatial magic immediately fell to the ground in fear when they heard their master's question. They had adjusted the coordinates no less than 800 times, but there was no response from the cursed bone gate. It was as if the Acid Fog Canyon had disappeared into the multiverse. The evil dragon had made similar attempts before. Several powerful ancient red dragons had used kindred orientation spells, but they were still unable to locate the Megalosaurus army. Thanks to the concealment of the god of virtual games Stim, the Acid Fog Canyon was situated between virtual reality and reality. Apart from certain special beings, even legendary tier spellcasters would not be able to sense the exact location of that plane. Naturally, it was impossible to re-establish a connection with it. No matter how they tried, it was to no avail. "Wasting time is wasting life," Bayer declared coldly. You are plotting against my life." With a single sentence, he labeled the 2 pit fiends as treason for their powerlessness. If they were caught, they would be demoted. A faint purple ray shot out from Bayer's hand, accurately hitting the 2 trembling pit fiends. Bound by their true names, they were unable to put up any resistance. In the end, they wailed and turned into 2 demented lesser demons. Bayer, who was still angry, did not let them go. He lifted his foot and stomped the 2 lesser demons to death. All the devils present kept quiet out of fear. The representatives sent by the evil Dragon Council also turned their heads to the side. However, the Megalosaurus seemed to have sensed some movement, and they quickly lowered their heads to the ground to show their obedience. A 5-headed Megalosaurus that was as large as a mountain suddenly appeared, slowly descending beside the cursed bone gate. "Great evil dragon queen," Seeing his nominal ally, Bayer still bowed politely and greeted him, even though it was just a projection. From the demeanor of this great devil, it was impossible to imagine his rage and his atrocities just now. How is the Otherworld Gate? With the enhancement of the Cursed Bone Gate, is it possible to reconnect with the Acid Fog Canyon? Without any pretense, Tiamat's projection asked straightforwardly because she was extremely anxious at the moment. Of course, she was anxious not because she was worried about the safety of the Megalosaurus army, but because of the unforeseen circumstances in the crusade against the tyrant worm. That abominable worm wanted to become a god, but it did not stop Tiamat. Instead, it wanted to get its hands on the Megalosaurus divine title. As the holder of the Megalosaurus divine title in the multiverse, and the one and only holder of this divine title, Tiamat could not tolerate a bug-like creature having similar authority to her. It was disrespectful to her, a serious blasphemy. That was why she spent time and effort to gather the 5-colored Megalosaurus to form an army and join the bloody battle in the Acid Fog Canyon. Because only by killing the tyrant worm in the abyss could she completely destroy the demon lord who wanted to get his hands on the Megalosaurus divine title. For this, Tiamat even reached a temporary truce with her mortal enemy, the platinum dragon god Bahamut, so that she could spare all her energy to completely destroy the tyrant worm. Originally, she wanted to wait for the Bahamut Expeditionary Army to expand their advantage and force the true body of the tyrant worm to join the battle. Then, she would personally descend to the Acid Fog Canyon and kill the blasphemous worm in one fell swoop. But now, the Bahamut Expeditionary Army had lost contact with the rear. She did not have any definite information about the progress of the war over there, whether the tyrant worm had successfully become a god, or whether the Megalosaurus divine title had been tainted. How could Tiamat not be anxious? Previously, she had tried to let the evil Dragon Council establish contact with the Acid Fog Canyon, but it did not work. Helplessly, she could only wait for Barty to use the hidden divine artifact of Avernus, the Cursed Bone Gate, a portal specially used to transfer troops for the Blood War, to try to find the Acid Fog Canyon. But it was still unsuccessful. Chapter 530. Awkwardness spread, and Bayer, who was equally helpless, smiled awkwardly, attempting to use some clever words to divert the Dragon Queen's attention. Perhaps we can launch an expedition. Without waiting for the Archdevil to speak, Tiamat's projection raised her head and looked at the sky of Avernus that was filled with rain of fire. Expedition. Bayer was proficient in all sorts of tactics and strategies, so he knew the true meaning of this phrase. He couldn't help but exclaim. The devils of Bader had not done this for many years. At the beginning of the Blood War, they had only used this tactic when they were fighting against the demons. The current Blood War had long since stopped sending large armies across the astral plane, launching fierce attacks from the outside of the abyss. After all, this was basically challenging all the demon lords, and they would be besieged by a massive army of demons from the abyss. In the current Blood War, apart from the normal battles between the Grey Planes and the 10,000 Abyss Planes, there were more scalpels that struck with precision. Be it devils or demons, these demons of the lower planes were all proficient in teleportation spells. Building a portal to another world was not difficult. Take the devils, for example. Keyes had airdropped them into the Acid Fog Canyon in order to build Hell's Gate. As long as there was an obvious beacon, the devils would be able to build a stable interplanar passage and send out expeditionary troops. For the devils, this innovation had many benefits. It could negate the disadvantage of having too many demons, maximizing the advantage of the elites of the Bader army. At the same time, it could prevent the accidental collapse of a battle line, leading to a large-scale chain of defeats in the Blood War. In a sense, this innovation also reduced the intensity of the bloody battlefield and reduced the casualties of the Bartholomew's 9 Hells in a short period of time. This allowed the devils to rely on the resources of the 9 planes to resist the abyss, which had a higher potential for war. Hence, when Tiamat suggested using primitive tactics, Baer could not agree to it no matter what. Madam Tiamat. The great demon did not use words like great or dragon queen, which sounded more respectful. From his words, one could feel that his attitude had become firm. I cannot agree with your point of view, and at the same time, I will not sign any orders related to it. He pushed aside the pit-fiend bodyguard beside him and walked up to Tiamat's projection, speaking in an unquestionable tone. This concerns the overall situation of the Blood War. I hope that Lord Tiamat can understand, unless Lord Astamores authorizes me. Mentioning the existence of Nessus, Barty was indeed trying to subdue the pentashade dragon queen. After all, he was a god, and at least half of the abyssal dragons in Avernus would obey his orders. As long as Tiamat opened her mouth, those devils with the blood of the evil dragon would most likely take the initiative to join her expeditionary army. Are you threatening me? He's just stating a fact, but his words lack consideration, so I need to make some additions. A calm voice suddenly sounded, but other than Barty and Tiamat's projection, no one else noticed it. My lord. Astamores. The tall and majestic deputy lord instantly lowered his body. Baer knelt on one knee and saluted the humanoid creature who was walking over. He remained kneeling after saluting, as if he would not get up until the end of time unless the other party agreed. There's no need for that. We are all serving the will of the 9 prisons of Bader. Moreover, the deputy lord and the lord have the same noble status. Like a gentle elder, Astamores slowly approached the cursed bone gate while speaking in a candid manner. He raised his palm, and Baer could not help but straighten his body, as if he was a puppet being controlled. However, it wasn't Astamores himself who displayed such power. In fact, it wasn't even his avatar. Similar to Tiamat, Astamores only sent his projection to participate in this meeting. No one knew the true appearance of the Lord of 9 Prisons. The image shown by this projection was the disguise that Astamores usually used. He was about 13 feet tall, with shiny black skin and hair. His face was thin and ancient. From his blood-red eyes, there was an evil and demonic light. There was a pair of sharp little horns on his forehead, and he looked inexplicably playful. The clothes he wore were a gorgeous robe inlaid with black diamonds and rubies, and he held a ruby scepter that symbolized power in his hand. The arrival of Astamores was indeed beyond Tiamat's expectations. To be honest, although the pentashade dragon queen had an agreement with this devil, and was considered an ally in the trenches, she still did not want to have too much contact with him. There was no other reason. Tiamat just felt danger. To be associated with Astamores, for any existence, was tantamount to frantically testing the edge of death. In terms of strength alone, even those great divine powers might not be able to guarantee that they would be able to defeat this primordial demon. As if he understood Tiamat's thoughts, Astamores did not care about the awkward silence at this time. He took the initiative to start a conversation. My lady, please forgive me. The words of the acting Lord of Baer just now were indeed a little harsh and rude. After all, he is still young. I can't apologize on his behalf, but I can give you an opinion as a supplement. Of course, the final decision is still in your hands. Tiamat nodded cautiously, and then her projection instantly dissipated, leaving only a lady in a black veil standing in the same place. In order to show that she valued Astamores, the pentashade dragon queen sent one of her avatars to talk with Astamores. What's your opinion? Hearing Tiamat's question, a smile appeared on the face of the Lord of Devils. He replied in a warm and gentle voice. Killing that worm is your goal. If necessary, why don't you change your way of thinking or change your means? The problem now is that we can't establish a gate between the alternate world and the acid fog canyon, or rather, we can't directly descend to that plane. That plane of the abyss seems to be covered with a layer of slippery protective cover by some existence, causing spatial spells to be unable to be anchored. That protective cover seems to be between illusion and reality, and it's very difficult to destroy with the current means. Unless... Astamores kept Tiamat in suspense, as if he was waiting for Tiamat to ask the question herself, and as expected, Tiamat did. What means do you have, or rather, what price do I have to pay in order to obtain the support you provide? The conversation between the two bosses made Bayer feel that he was indeed lacking in knowledge. At least in terms of the knowledge of the devils, there was still a big gap between him and the Lord of Nine Hells. The words spoken by Astamores always made people feel as if they were bathing in the spring breeze and felt sincere. However, that was actually impossible. Some people think that the method is very valuable, but I don't think so. A vivid smile appeared on Astamores' face, making it hard to believe that it was just a projection. So I will tell you that instead of wasting effort to remove the protective cover, it's better to directly destroy the plane of the acid fog canyon from the inside. Without flesh and blood, there's naturally no place for hair to attach to. The tyrant worm can either choose to die inside or come out to die. Chapter 531. True Name. Seeing Tiamat's doubtful expression, Astamores used a certain method to convey his intentions to her. Bayer, who was standing at the side, was completely unaware of all this. In fact, apart from the Pentached Dragon Queen and the acting Lord of the Nine Hells, no one else knew of the arrival of the Lord of the Nine Hells. It was still doubtful whether this Devil Lord was the strongest in the multiverse, but when it came to keeping secrets, no one could compare to him. What was even more frightening was that in order to carry out his schemes, he could lay down foreshadowing for tens or even hundreds of thousands of years, waiting for the right time. For example, he had grasped the true names of almost all greater devils. This foreshadowing had come in handy now. Due to the nature of the Batsu people, all devils will be shackled by their true names, unless they've already deviated from their alignment. As long as the devil is still in the multiverse, he'll have to respond accordingly. Even if there's a barrier outside the acid fog canyon, by using his true name, he'll still be able to smoothly control the actions of the devils trapped in that plane. Astamores gave an explanation. Although it wasn't very detailed, Tiamat quickly understood the essence of his opinion with her wisdom and knowledge as a god. What do I need to pay, and to what extent can you achieve by using your true name? The Dragon Queen asked bluntly. 13 pit fiends. 5 of them are about to advance to the rank of Soul Pit Fiend. I can use my true name to make them willingly offer up all their worth. It'll form a terrifying curse that can be used to destroy the core of the acid fog canyon. Astamores smiled as he spoke, as if he was talking about a trivial matter. He even seemed a little indifferent. However, the evil in his words caused Tiamat, who was also a god of the evil alignment, to tremble in fear. No wonder, glancing at Bayer, who was still unaware, the Pentached Dragon Queen thought to herself. He doesn't want anyone else to know about this. Using his true name to force the pit fiends to offer up all their worth would make all greater devils unable to eat or sleep in peace. This was because almost all of their true names were in the hands of Astamores. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, the Lord of the Nine Hells had created a place for advancement called the Dark Auditorium. Since then, most greater devils had walked out of the Dark Auditorium. When they advanced, they had to recite their true names. Only then would the Dark Auditorium use the power of the 9 prisons of Bader to acknowledge the devils and bless them to advance. At the same time, the true names that were recited would be transmitted to Astamores. You didn't answer me, she said, staring at the projection of the Devil Lord's projection. What do I have to pay you? The acting feudal lord I appointed is very paranoid. He doesn't trust the other Batsu because he's worried about Zariel's restoration. The abyssal draconic demon you created is actually quite trusted by him, so I hope you can give him a little more help. Is Tidit was of this of tier. After careful consideration and weighing the pros and cons, Tidit found that she had no choice but to agree. I can give you control of the abyssal draconic demon, the Pentashe Dragon Queen's avatar replied, but you have to wait until I kill that worm. Although it was said to be for Barty's sake, in reality, Astamor's was just placing a spy by his side. The Lord of the Nine Hells smiled again after receiving a reply. Thank you for your generosity, but as you know, He raised the ruby scepter in his hand and tapped it lightly. A projection of a tumbling river appeared in front of him. Devils believe in contracts more than verbal promises, Astamor said solemnly with a solemn expression. Tidit had no choice but to sign a contract with the Devil Lord and use the river Styx as a witness. Astamor carefully put away the contract that had been conjured into his robes and began to carry out the contract. He walked slowly towards the cursed bone gate. He did not chant or make any hand gestures. However, his ruby scepter was flashing, occasionally revealing a long stretch of purgatory runes that were as small as mosquitoes. Astamor walked to the cursed bone door and reached out his hand to gently touch the bones on the door frame. In the center of the bone door, a red mist appeared. It was spinning, flipping, and taking on various forms. This was the sign that the cursed bone door was connected to another dimension. The previous spellcasters had tried to connect to the acid fog canyon but had failed. The red mist that they summoned was at most the size of a fist. It was not even 1% of the Lord of the Nine Hells. However, in order to fully connect, the red mist would have to cover the entire cursed bone door. It was still far from that. However, Astamor's did not need to do that. Found it. The Devil Lord sensed the coordinates of the distant dimension and said with certainty, "This is the dimension of the acid fog canyon." Immediately after, he used the ruby scepter in his other hand to hit the red mist 13 times. Every strike would disperse a portion of the fog. When the final gouge was completed, the entire red fog that had been summoned by him disappeared. It's done. The shortest is 3 days and the longest will not exceed 7 days. The acid fog canyon dimension will be destroyed by the curse. The dimension of the acid fog canyon. Stopping beside the last fortress, the new boom town waited quietly. Its city intestine was desperately digesting the new boom town. In just 5 days, this traction city had swept through more than 50 Fort Bot-Or in succession, gathering all the resources and manpower they had. Other than the first few ignorant Fort Bot-Or generals who actively resisted and died in the end, the other commanders wisely chose to surrender. Therefore, Keyes gathered a large number of demon soldiers. However, the new boom town still did not have enough space to accommodate them. They could only be divided according to their fighting strength. The stronger devils were placed in the city, while the weaker ones could only follow the traction city on foot. Now that there were no targets to gather, Keyes immediately gathered all the Fort Bot-Or generals. He wanted to mobilize them before the great battle. Everyone, the young blue dragon nodded as he looked at the greater demons that filled up the audience room. He was about to begin his speech. However, something unexpected happened at this moment. Of the 50 or so generals, more than 40 were pit fiends. Among them, there were even 5 that were close to advancing to the unique pit fiend realm. These 5 powerful pit fiends were the first to react. Their eyes widened as blood spurted out of their orifices. Soon after, the other 8 pit fiends were in a similar situation. A total of 13 pit fiends were bleeding profusely. All the Fort Bot-Or generals were on guard against the others, especially the young blue dragon sitting at the head of the table. Chapter 532. It was no wonder that the devil generals were wary of Keyes. With the nature of devils, they were already restraining themselves. Of course, this was partly due to their fear of the young blue dragon's strength, but it was also due to their suspicion of what had happened to the pit fiends. According to the logic of devils, even if they wanted to get rid of their enemies, it was best not to do so in public. The pit fiends that were in trouble were scattered all over the place, appearing in random corners of the audience room. If Keys really wanted to kill them to establish his might, he would have gathered them together and dealt with them all at once. To be able to become the commander of Bator, none of these devil generals were brainless fools. Thus, they were more worried about another possibility. It could have been a premeditated assassination, an act of revenge on the part of Stim or the Tyrant of Worms. If not for the fact that they were worried that the young blue dragon would make things difficult for them afterwards, they would have wanted to leave as soon as possible. Although they did not leave immediately, they were frantically casting all sorts of defensive spells on themselves. Detect poison. Anti-justice aura. Flame shield. Looking at the magic light that lit up in his arcane vision, Quest snorted, and his vast and boundless spirit ability was suddenly activated. With the increase in his strength, Keys's usage of his spirit ability had not changed much. However, the total amount of his spirit capacity was frighteningly high. With his own strength, he was able to forcefully destroy all the spells in the audience room and seal the minds of everyone present. Noisy, the young blue dragon spat out coldly, and then turned his gaze to the 13 pit fiends. The sudden burst of light from the spells had interfered with his observation, and he had not been able to see many minute changes clearly. According to Keys's observations, these pit fiends that had become bloodied were most likely cursed by some sort of sudden curse. Furthermore, based on his judgment, this curse was not something that the god of virtual games, Stim, would use for revenge. Otherwise, since he could curse them, wouldn't it be better to let them self-destruct? Wouldn't that bring more trouble to Keys? Of course, Keys didn't let his guard down. He didn't even use any spells or spiritual abilities, as he was worried that he'd trigger some sort of restriction. Instead, he used the force field of the Force Dragon to lift them up and throw them out of Traction City. Due to the danger, he did not call out to his companions. He just stood there and waited for the final result of the curse. After all, cursing 13 pit fiends at the same time was no easy feat. There had to be a bigger scheme behind this. However, due to the interference of the other demon generals, Keys was unable to observe the minute changes at the start of the curse. Therefore, he couldn't make a judgment right now. He could only use a safer method to minimize the possible damage. Fortunately, this curse didn't take Keys too long. About half an hourglass later, the 13 pit fiends woke up from their dazed state. Not only did they not try to heal themselves, they even used more extreme methods to destroy their own bodies. Their actions were uniform. First, they reached their hands behind their backs and tore off their wings. Then, they grabbed the horns on their heads and forcefully broke them. They used their sharp claws to tear off their flesh and blood, turning themselves into ragdolls. Not long after, perhaps because he was the weakest, a heavily injured pit fiend collapsed in a pool of his own blood. The blood that originated from his body seemed to have turned into a highly corrosive liquid at this time. Soon, the remaining flesh and the body parts that were previously torn off were all dissolved into a blood-red ointment. There were bubbles on it from time to time. Next, a second, a third, a fourth. A total of 13 pit fiends collapsed, turning into paste on the ground. Keys's brows furrowed tightly as he watched the remains of the pit fiends fuse together into a small lake. After all, the fiends of the lower realms were creatures of soul and body as one. Their flesh and soul were inseparable. The blood lake that appeared in front of Keys contained the souls of 13 pit fiends. 5 of them were unique pit fiends. They were at the peak of Batsu's path of advancement. Every pit fiend was a powerhouse that had walked over mountains of corpses and seas of blood. Their experiences fully demonstrated what it meant to be a general builds his success on the bones of 10,000. The amount of resources that were needed was probably not enough even if the same number of material planes were used. Due to the nature of creatures of the lower realms, most of those resources would be used to strengthen their own souls. One could only imagine how precious the souls of pit fiends were. They were definitely precious treasures of the 9 prisons of Bader. Using the soul of a pit fiend to strengthen a spell would definitely be at the legendary rank. But now, this curse had actually combined the souls of 13 pit fiends. While Karth didn't know what would happen next, he had a rough guess based on his intuition and knowledge. He was deeply shaken by his own guess. This must be the doing of that existence. Only he knows the true names of all the pit fiends. Only by using the power of the true names can he control them across planes. He's either trying to break through the plane's seal, or using the power of the curse to attack Stim and the Tyrant Worm. Or perhaps... He suddenly thought of a possibility, and Keys immediately teleported back to Traction City. He immediately gave the order to activate the engine. Fortunately, as Traction City was an extremely large machine, its engine would not be completely extinguished. At most, it would be in a standby state. Thus, less than a tenth of an hourglass after Keys gave the order, the tracks under the base began to move once more. Following closely behind the mobile fortress, the army of devils outside New Prosperity Town also quickly moved out, retreating to even further places. Sand and dust filled the air, and figures flickered in and out. Only the tracks left behind a deep trench and a small blood-red lake on the ground. The avatar of the Prince of Darkness had been observing Keys all this time, and had only removed his invisibility after Traction City had left. He could clearly see me, but he pretended not to see me. Graz ZT felt a little indignant at being ignored. Traction City is like a knight attacking from behind. I'd like to see what's wrong with this pool of blood. Could it be? Chapter 533. As if to verify his words, Graz ZT was just about to extract something from the pool of blood for his own observation and research when something strange happened. Like a bathtub with a drain, a whirlpool appeared in the middle of the pool of blood. The scarlet ointment slowly seeped into it, and before long, the pool of blood disappeared without a trace. This is... Graz ZT walked forward suspiciously, wanting to investigate the cause of the leak. Hiss, I have to leave quickly. With his astonishing eyesight, he quickly found the passage where the pool of blood had disappeared. It was a hole about the size of a fist, extending straight into the depths of the acid fog canyon. The hole was pitch black, and when one looked down, they could only see some flashing red spots. Of course, this was only the view of an ordinary person. The Dark Prince's eyes could see much more. It was precisely because of this that he'd turned pale with fright. He'd even thought of leaving the acid fog canyon as soon as possible. The paste that had been mixed with the flesh and souls of the 13 pit fiends had actually seeped into the depths of the plane, corroding its core. The so-called plane core was actually a source core that could be condensed into a plane. It could absorb the surrounding matter and use it to achieve the effect of stabilizing the plane. However, apart from being sturdy enough, this type of origin core was not very useful. It was also very difficult to use. Generally speaking, although the Demon Lords and Demon Lords of the lower planes had the ability to shatter a plane's source core, they would rarely lay their hands on a plane's source core even if they wanted to destroy a plane. This was because the gains did not make up for the losses. Take the Demon Lords for example. The battles between them were as long as bloody battles, but the cause of the battles was either hatred or the accumulation of resources and wealth. Ultimately, there had to be benefits. Destroying the plane core of an opponent's territory could certainly weaken their forces, but after the plane collapsed, the most precious treasure of the plane, souls, would no longer be able to be harvested endlessly even if they won. This was a completely short-sighted act. Even the abominations that lived to destroy all things, and the ancient evils that had no sense of reason, would not choose to do this. Their actions were also inclined towards slaughtering the living beings of a plane, and then waiting for them to slowly recover before harvesting leaks in batches. Moreover, there were very few planes in the multiverse that could give birth to souls. For example, the seemingly endless plains in the bottomless abyss were actually the result of deliberate accumulation under the guidance of the abyss will. This was the foundation of the bottomless abyss. If any demon lord dared to risk universal condemnation and destroy a plane's origin core, the will of the abyss would probably descend immediately and teach them how to be demons. Besides, destroying a plane's origin core was an extremely difficult thing to do, apart from the fact that there weren't many benefits and there were many risks involved. Purely physical methods were almost useless. Not only were most of the plane's source cores hidden in the depths of the plane, but they were also especially sturdy. As for spells, most of them had to be top-notch legendary spells. In terms of the requirements and difficulty of performing it was at least on par with the level of Karsistan's divine spell. In truth, Astamor seemed to be doing it casually, but he'd used his true name to control the 13 pit fiends. He'd used the power of their flesh and souls to indirectly cast this curse. While the pit fiends could be killed, they would most likely be reborn 99 years later in Baator after a normal death. If they had other methods, they might be reborn much earlier. They'd definitely lose some of their strength, but the most serious consequence would be a drop in rank. However, their flesh and souls had been mixed into this curse by the Devil Lord. There was absolutely no chance of them being reborn. In terms of value, the resources needed to create the 13 pit fiends might even be more than the total amount of resources in the Acid Fog Canyon. Therefore, Astamors had invested heavily in this, using a method that was more powerful than he was to destroy a plane's origin core. If not for the benefits he'd obtained from Tiamat, the shrewdness of the Devil Lord would definitely not have allowed him to do this. Using this method, in a sense, the effect was absolutely remarkable. In less than 2 hourglasses, the curse had already gnawed at the surface of the plane's source core. If Stim hadn't concealed the Acid Fog Canyon, the will of the abyss would have sensed that something was wrong with the plane's origin core. It would most likely descend here in anger. However, the first to sense it was the god of virtual games. It felt as if he'd set up a server here and was operating a game. Originally, it was just a player challenging the operating rules, but someone had suddenly barged into the computer room and started smashing the server without a second word. This feeling could be said to be unparalleled. Stim, who'd been arguing with Buffett, suddenly flushed red. He then spat out dark golden blood. However, he didn't have the time to care about his injuries. Various data appeared in his eyes as he nervously searched for the source of the problem. Because he spoke too quickly, he spat out another mouthful of blood. Is destroying the plane's origin core, damn it? Hearing Stim's words, Buffett, who was standing in front of him, turned pale with fright. Who has the guts to do this, dwarf? Speak quickly. As the incarnation of a demon lord, he knew very well what the plane's origin core meant. Compared to the possible effects he might suffer now, he was more worried about whether the will of the abyss would take its anger out on him in the future. Therefore, he was very anxious, like an ant on a hot pan. And he was definitely not the only ant like this in the Acid Fog Canyon. What's going on? A surge of power came from the depths of the earth. The true body of the tyrant worm had no choice but to burrow out from the soil that was squeezing it. All of the demon worms became very frightened. They could feel that a fatal disaster had quietly descended upon them. Creek. The orifices that were emitting sulfuric acid gas seemed to have gone mad as they sprayed poisonous gas outward. The ground began to crack rapidly. The lava that had been hidden deep underground began to churn and converge on the surface. From time to time, it would gush out from the weak spots. The entire Acid Fog Canyon seemed to have turned into an iron pot that had been burned red. Everywhere was boiling and scorching hot. Chapter 534. The Acid Fog Canyon was in a mess. Due to the gradual destruction of the plane's core, all the forces were in a mess. Among them, the most vexed was of course the tyrant worm. After all, he was the master of this plane in name. Stim. The huge worm crawled out of the cave tunnel. Not long after the mutation, he immediately took a shortcut back to the broken canyon. The tyrant worm's true body was swollen, emitting a dangerous acidic poisonous fog. A long tongue extended from its circular mouthpart. The incarnation that had fallen in the ashes plain had regenerated on the tip of its tongue. At this moment, it was constantly roaring and questioning. "Shut your mouth, damned worm." Buffett was also irritated. He slammed his machete on the ground, letting out a deafening roar. Symbol of death. The tyrant worm, who had long been enraged, no longer had any scruples. He directly launched an attack on Buffett. After consuming the spell energy stored in one link, a powerful legendary necromancy spell was instantly formed and shot out. Endless hatred, coupled with the determination to kill the opponent, the two complemented each other to ensure the success of this spell. Due to the close distance and the fact that he was not prepared for the opponent's sudden attack, the Tauren King was unfortunately hit by the spell. However, with the strong body and soul of the Demon Lord's incarnation, even if the symbol of death was a legendary spell, it was still unable to kill him directly. At most, he would feel intense pain. In addition, he was unusually angry. This lowly worm actually dared to sneak attack a powerful demon lord. In the Acid Fog Canyon plain, Buffett's face had been repeatedly slapped swollen. The spell had an effect, but it did not achieve its goal. The Tauren King immediately recovered from the state of being attacked. "You're looking for death," Buffett roared angrily. He picked up the machete in his hand and was about to slash at the tyrant worm. He was obviously not going to show any mercy. When the conflict between the bosses broke out, their subordinates naturally would not stay there foolishly and pretend that nothing had happened. The half-demon minotaurs seemed to have contracted mad cow disease. Their muscles bulged and their eyes turned crimson. They drew their weapons and charged at the worms nearby. The latter's reaction wasn't any worse, especially the cataclysmic worms. As the children of the tyrant worm, they could empathize with their creator's anger. It seemed that the two sides were about to erupt into a fierce battle. The all-out battle that wasn't rare in the demon army was about to take place. "Enough, you two idiots!" At some point, the short dwarf god suddenly appeared between Buffett and the tyrant worm, who were in the middle of their battle. Although his face was pale, he still successfully controlled the two demon lords and forcibly stopped their conflict. Stim used his left hand to hold Buffett's machete, while his right hand summoned a pale golden barrier, isolating the huge body of the tyrant worm on the other side. Now is not the time for internal strife. If you don't start saving yourselves, do you too want to personally bear the wrath of the will of the abyss? Although his voice wasn't loud, when it reached the ears of the two demon lords, it was no less than a sudden clap of thunder. Seeing that they didn't intend to continue fighting for the time being, Stim secretly breathed a sigh of relief. He wasn't good at fighting. Not long ago, because the plane source core in the Acid Fog Canyon was damaged, it caused him to suffer a lot of impact. He hadn't fully recovered yet. Just now, when he forcibly stopped the two demon lords, it seemed easy, but in fact, only he knew how much divine power he had consumed. The plane source core is damaged, but it's not completely destroyed. Don't interrupt. Now, listen. What? Say. Finish. Seeing that Helmet, who was on the tip of the tyrant worm's tongue, was about to open his mouth to ask, Stim mercilessly interrupted his thoughts. "I will release part of my authority, and at the same time, guard against any external enemies that might descend upon the Acid Fog Canyon. If you don't want to face the enraged will of the abyss, then you, the tyrant worm, will have to personally go to the depths of the plane and deal with the curse on the plane source core." After saying this, he turned his head to look at Buffett. "And you, the Tauren King, will now send out your troops to teach the fellow who has won the title of Ultimate Overlord a lesson, and get rid of the hidden dangers left in the plain of the acid fog canyon. At this moment, the god of virtual games showed his powerful ability to set up a plan. The two demon lords who had just been about to fight to the death suddenly realized that if they worked together, they would benefit from it, and if they didn't, they would suffer from it. It was very strange, but it was also very natural. After all, in the face of common pressure, this was indeed their best choice at the moment. As for what would happen after they got through this, they would talk about it later. The three of them knew very well that the alliance was only temporary, and that this kind of relationship would break down sooner or later. Each of them had their own plans in mind, and there was no need to explain things that they already knew. "We'll listen to you for now, little dwarf." Although it seemed rude on the surface, Buffett was the first to express his agreement, and was half a beat faster than the dragon's subbody, Hemtar. "Give me the authority immediately, and don't mention any damn neutral monsters again. I'm going to repair the plane source core," and then, Stim interrupted him again, and the Tauren King looked on coldly from the sidelines. "Your command of the army now needs to be temporarily handed over to the Tauren King. He has more experience in dealing with war, and besides, you have other things to do." The situation on the field was 3 against 2. The tyrant worm growled helplessly in a low voice, and ordered the demon worms to listen to Buffett's orders for the time being. After that, he didn't look back and burrowed into a cave tunnel. He regretted coming into contact with these two fellows in the beginning, and he shouldn't have let them come at all. But it was too late now, and it was easier to invite the devil in than to send him away. After the tyrant worm left in a hurry, Buffett glanced at Stim, who was deep in thought, and the Tauren King snorted disdainfully. "You should have taken the initiative to attack long ago. You thought you could control the situation, but in the end, it's just a joke." Without waiting for the dwarf god to refute, Stim didn't actually have such thoughts. Buffett used the language of the abyss to give the order to set off immediately, and then his figure gradually dissipated. It was unknown whether he was hiding or using a high-level teleportation to leave directly. Although he didn't repeat his order, the majority of demons didn't dare to ignore the orders of a demon lord. Even those demon worms who had doubts in their hearts had received the tyrant worm's instructions before, so they were very obedient. The mighty army left directly from the broken canyon, leaving behind only empty buildings and a god who was deep in thought. Chapter 535. Ding. The system has detected that the title of Final Overlord has been achieved. The available rewards are as follows. Please consider the exchange accordingly. The familiar voice sounded, causing Quest to be secretly shocked. Now that things had developed to this point, he did not expect that the god of virtual games would still open the exchange list to him, and was even prepared to fulfill the promised rewards. Might as well take a look at the rewards he gave. Who knows, I might be able to figure something out from it. If there's a problem, I might be able to make some preparations beforehand. Having made up his mind, Keyes picked up the exchange list disguised as a piece of parchment and quickly browsed through the updated contents. There are a total of 5 reward options. Flag bearers may choose any 3 of them. Please consider carefully. Reward 1. All accumulated gold coins can be exchanged for a standard soul prism at a rate of 3 to 1. Reward 2. Achieving the title of Final Overlord. The faction of this plane will retaliate and provide a copy of the Acid Fog Canyon military map. Reward 3. A mildly damaged mice energy core. Do not doubt the god's sincerity. Mildly damaged indeed means that it can be repaired. Reward 4. A safe passage for retreat. Even if the Acid Fog Canyon is destroyed, you can quickly retreat to the 10,000 abyss plains. Reward 5. A complete divinity. After assimilation, you can become a vassal of the god of virtual games, breaking away from the ranks of mortals. After reading the introductions, Keyes carefully browsed through the additional explanations before slowly closing the exchange list. What a scheming old fox! It was clear that the most valuable of the 5 rewards was the complete divinity. It was a treasure that could allow mortals to reach the heavens in a single bound. In any plane of the multiverse, such a treasure would make countless people go crazy and fight for it with all their might. However, it only took a little thought to understand that this was actually a test by Stim. A divinity that could allow mortals to become vassal of gods must have been stripped from a part of his current divine title. If he assimilated the divinity, he would definitely be under his jurisdiction. Therefore, if Keyes avoided this option, it would be a clear indication that he had a conflict with Stim. In other words, it meant that he had the intention to deal with the dwarf god, and his attitude was very firm. There was no guarantee that the dwarf would not set up countermeasures. As for the 4th reward, the safe retreat to the 10,000 abyss planes, it was obviously an option that matched the divinity reward. The dwarf god was just telling Keyes that if he became his subordinate, he had the confidence and channels to ensure that Keyes could escape unscathed. Apart from that, the 2nd and 3rd rewards were also related. Stim knew that Keyes had Traction Citadel, so he provided a slightly damaged mice energy core. If it was repaired and installed on Traction Citadel, it would definitely increase Keyes' military strength. Moreover, he had most likely fallen out with Buffett and the Tyrant Worm, so while enhancing Keyes' strength, he could also reveal the other party's military deployment through the 2nd reward. Then, it was entirely possible for Keyes to restrain the 2 demon lords. At that time, even if Keyes did not choose the 4th and 5th options, he could still leave calmly, leaving them to fight to the death in the acid fog canyon, where the source core of the plane was damaged, to restrain each other. As for the 1st reward, not only was it not a smokescreen, it was even a booster left behind for Keyes' next actions, either to stand with him or to fight the demon lords. Whether it was to ascend to godhood or to start a war, a large amount of resources were needed to support it. Without money, it would be difficult to move an inch. However, with Stim's financial support, no matter which path Keyes chose, the efficiency of the operation would be greatly increased. Increased efficiency meant that time was saved, and judging from the current situation in the acid fog canyon, saving time was treasuring life. The 5 options are linked together, combining probing, pushing, and even showing goodwill. The thoughts of the gods are extraordinary. However, the gods could not be omniscient and omnipotent. Although Stim's understanding of Keyes was certainly not superficial, the difference in information was still unavoidable. Therefore, he did not know of the young blue dragon's ability to actively adapt, nor did he know of his true plans. Exchange Reward 1, Reward 3, Reward 5. After thinking it through, Keyes immediately picked up the exchange list, ticked the reward he urgently needed, and entered the secret imprint to confirm. As if it had been prepared long ago, the moment he finished ticking, the exchange list in the shape of a parchment began to spontaneously combust. When the ashes drifted away, the reward items were neatly stacked in front of him, and the exchange list had completely disappeared. After clearing the remaining 600,000 gold coins, Keyes obtained more than 200,000 standard units of soul prisms. This wealth seemed enormous, but it was the easiest to deal with. With a wave of his hand, the young blue dragon kept all the soul prisms into his storage space. The remaining 2 rewards, the divinity and the slightly damaged mice energy core. After thinking for a while, Keyes reached out his hand to the former. Unlike the common understanding that the divinity was shaped like a bright crystal, the divinity bestowed by Stim had the appearance of a gray stone. If it was casually thrown into a plane, it was possible that many years would pass without anyone discovering its extraordinariness. However, when Keyes' fingers came into contact with the divinity, his eyebrows furrowed tightly. However, without thinking for too long, he completely grasped it in his hand, and began to chant the incantation of a spell in a low voice. Treasure Concealment Spell. This was a very obscure legendary spell recorded in the Inheritance of the Megalosaurus race. The purpose of inventing this legendary spell was only to make it convenient for those megalosaurus who were extremely interested in their own wealth to conceal a certain treasure that they possessed. In essence, this could actually be considered a legendary sealing spell, but it was of little use in increasing one's combat strength. Even the long-lived megalosaurus would generally not learn this spell. This was because most megalosaurus thought in a very simple way. As long as one's strength was strong enough, one's treasure would naturally not be lost, and there was no need to use the treasure concealment spell at all. However, in line with the idea that there was no harm in having more skills, Keyes had studied this spell before, and he did not expect it to come in handy now. After the hourglass-long incantation ended, the divinity, which was originally not very conspicuous, now looked much more plain and ordinary. Whether it was distinguishing from its appearance or using ordinary detection spells, all that could be observed was just a rock. After doing all this, Keyes breathed a sigh of relief, and only then did he swallow the divinity into his stomach. That's right, Megalosaurus had a special space in their abdominal cavity for storing items, and they would temporarily store things that were too important and not too big in size. Finally, he still had one more reward to deal with. Chapter 536. Professional matters had to be dealt with by professionals. While preparing to deal with the mice energy nucleus, Keyes used magic to send a message to Shay and Snade, seeking their help. When the two of them arrived and saw the thing that Keyes had placed on the table, their gazes never left it. The mice energy nucleus was the most advanced creation of magic in the world of Toril, and it could almost be added with the suffix one of a kind. The world of Toril had a god who specialized in managing magic. That existence had set up strict rules and a complex magic network. Unless one became a great arcanist, ordinary mages in that world had to go through this magic network if they wanted to cast spells. Although this arrangement by the gods had lowered the requirement of talent for the spellcaster profession, they did not need to have extraordinary intelligence. They only needed to learn and memorize, step by step unlocking access to the magic network, and they could gradually grow into a qualified spellcaster. But this also brought about many problems, such as excessive reliance on the magic network to cast spells. There was an objective ceiling for the mage profession. And even though there was no need to pay faith to use the magic network, from a certain point of view, such mages were actually very similar to priests. Of course, there were always a few people in the world who were so gifted that their talents were high enough to make the gods envious. Some mages with extraordinary intelligence gradually realized the limitations of the magic network, and through slowly fumbling, they finally succeeded in getting rid of the crutch. Without the help of the magic network, they could still cast spells. Not only were there more varieties, but the power was even more powerful. In the world of Toril, they were called arcanists, magic masters who cast spells by exploring the mysteries of the rules. Among them, the best were the great arcanists. And Elam was one of the best among these great arcanists. Elam invented the mice energy nucleus, and its function was to be compatible with the rules of the plane, and then absorb magic energy from the environment. In the beginning, he had invented the mice energy core because he couldn't satisfy his need for items with constant spell effects. This great arcanist was born in the early days of the Nile era. Although the Nile people had discovered the Nile secret scroll and studied it for more than 200 years, the magic skills at that time were still very crude. Especially in the creation of magic items, even the great arcanists at that time could not bypass the support of the magic network and add permanent magic effects to their magic creations. Perhaps out of fear, the gods who had mastered the priesthood of magic set very strict rules for the creation of magic items by mortals. Every time they enchanted those magic creations, it not only required a lot of mental energy from the spellcasters, but it also affected their health. In those days, it was not difficult to recognize the arcanists who often made magic items with constant effects at a glance. Compared to their actual age, they always looked particularly old and tired. In this problem, the great arcanists at that time but still did not have any result. Because Netheril had not discovered materials that could store magic energy in that era, they could only connect to the magic network to provide energy for their magic creations. In this way, the method of maintaining the effects of magic spells was actually to imitate how ordinary mages cast their spells. However, in order to use the magic network, ordinary mages would need to meditate every day. This was similar to how believers prayed to provide power for the gods, while mages' meditation was to pay for the cost of using the magic network. The principle of equivalent exchange was followed. If it was an ordinary mage, then there was no problem. They could use the magic network to pay with meditation every day. But the magic creations were not living people, and they could not meditate. Therefore, to connect them to the magic network, the creator of the magic creations had to pay in advance for this fee. Until Iolam changed his mind and invented the mice energy core, bypassing the authority of the magic network and successfully connecting this magical object with the origin of magic in the multiverse. Then, the mice energy core could manifest certain rules, absorb all kinds of energy in the surroundings, and then convert it into magic energy with extremely high conversion efficiency, and give it to the objects authorized by the mice energy core's owner within a certain range. By the end of the Silver Age, the mice energy core had even developed to the point where it could replace part of the magic network, allowing any mortal within a certain range to cast simple spells as long as they paid a certain amount of mental energy, thus becoming a blue-striped mage. And it was precisely because of the mice energy core that the great arcanists of Netheril were able to create the floating city, a kind of miracle super-large-scale magic creation, and become one of the few mage empires in the whole of Toriel, and even in the whole multiverse. One could imagine how desperate their enemies would be when a flying city descended over their heads, and most of the people living in the city could cast spells, even if they were very rudimentary. Among the great arcanists at that time, it had become a fashionable activity to ride the floating city to descend to the lower planes, look for a weak demon lord to start a war, and then plunder the resources and wealth of that plane. Although the civilization of Netheril had basically disappeared in the long river of history, for a race with a long lifespan like the demons, the fear of being dominated by the floating city of the great arcanists was still deeply etched in their minds. Stim gave Keys such a reward because he had a sudden idea after seeing Traction City. He wanted him to quickly create a floating city, and then use it to deal with Buffett's subordinates and those worms and demons. As long as these troops were restrained, Keys would be free to personally deal with the two demon lords. In this way, the final result might be biased towards the young blue dragon. In this way, not only would the two demon lords have to taste the bitter fruit of failure, but they would also most likely be held accountable by the will of the abyss. They would definitely not be able to retaliate against Stim immediately, and he would also be able to leave the Acid Fog Canyon more safely. However, even though Quest knew of his plan, he still did not feel any resistance. Instead, it was exactly what he wanted. He also wanted to use this mice energy core to make a big fuss and become the ultimate overlord that deserved to be called the ultimate overlord. I really can't believe that apart from the treasure in Shadow City, I can still see such a well-preserved mice energy nucleus. This is the most precious treasure of the Netheril era. Looking at the magic creation in front of him, the half-lich Snade couldn't help but sigh with emotion. Shay also nodded in agreement. Chapter 537. Praise aside, Shay and Snade had no intention of treating the mice energy nucleus as an antique when they studied it. This was something that could not be helped. If they wanted to repair this legendary creation of Netheril, they had to first open it. The size of the mice energy nucleus was the same as an old-fashioned fireplace. Its appearance was like a hollow armillary sphere, wrapped in many layers of metal rings. Keys had tried it once before and found that there were no rivets or welds that could be easily opened. Forcefully breaking it open would most likely damage this legendary creation, so they could only open its shell bit by bit according to the rules. It had to be admitted that Elam, the inventor of the mice energy nucleus, was definitely a man of extraordinary talent, and his attainments in spatial geometry were profound. According to Shay's inference, the mice energy nucleus had a total of 17 layers of shells. If they wanted to open it up, they had to be put back in place correctly. This was somewhat similar to assembling a Rubik's Cube, but Keyes knew that due to the limitations of the manufacturing method, the Rubik's Cube could only be designed up to grade 9 at most. However, the mice energy nucleus had a total of 17 layers. If one's intelligence was not enough, even if they worked hard for 100 years, they might not succeed. With no other choice, Keyes and the others could only choose to cheat. Let Sneyd use a prophecy spell to determine whether certain key steps were correct or not. It was no exaggeration to say that even if they used a cheating method, it was still very difficult, and they almost failed at the last moment. Because Keyes' prophecy spell was somewhat unreliable, this 2-hourglass-long cheat could only be completed by Sneyd. Although he was a half-lich and a powerful legendary spellcaster, he had almost exhausted all his energy to persevere until the end. "It's done." Keyes breathed a sigh of relief. When the last metal ring was put back in place, the internal structure of the mice energy nucleus was finally revealed. In the center of the mice energy nucleus, there was a three-dimensional network woven from thin mithril thread. As if there was no gravity, this network quietly floated in front of everyone's eyes. From Keyes's point of view, he seemed to have seen something and could not help but exclaim, "This is the spell structure of Sunburst." Shay said with some confusion, "This seems to be a magic circle that reduces the dissipation of energy. The tracker has it in his body, but it doesn't." Hearing their conversation, Sneyd, who had been resting on the side due to his exhaustion, also walked over and curiously looked at the mithril thread. "This is a negative energy harmonization array, no." He controlled the mechanical artificial body and looked left and right. From time to time, he would squat down to check. After a while, he stopped. "What a genius invention!" The half-lich could not help but exclaim, "Compared to Elam, my intelligence is at most a groundhog." Following his example, Keyes and Shay also looked around and finally understood why Sneyd sighed. It turned out that the structure they had just seen was not wrong. However, as long as one looked at it from a different angle, the structure of this mass of mithril threads was different. The three of them identified it separately and then did some calculations. This small ball of three-dimensional mithril thread actually had more than 300 types of formation structures with specific functions. According to their estimates, there should be even more structures. However, due to their lack of knowledge, they could not identify all of them. Generally speaking, a magic item only needed to be engraved with one type of formation. At most, it would be a combination of several formations. However, this mass of mithril threads in the middle of the mice energy core was composed of at least hundreds or even thousands of formations. This was no longer a technical problem. The mice energy core was more like a product of the laws. No wonder. Keyes understood. The mice energy core can automatically control and absorb the free energy around it and continuously supply it to the magic items and individuals around it. It also does not need to be restricted by the gods, bypassing the weave of the world of Toril. Emotion, admiration, curiosity, all kinds of emotions were present. However, the biggest problem now was how to repair this magic item. During his observation, Keyes discovered what Stim had said about the slight damage. Although mithril was very malleable and tough, after being stretched to the thickness of a spider's web, its strength was definitely not enough. After receiving a strong impact, the mithril threads could also be damaged, breaking or bending. When he was calculating the number of formations, Keyes discovered that there were a dozen or so threads that seemed to be in the wrong position. This was because the formation structure made of them was mostly problematic. However, he could not be completely sure, so he could not repair it himself. He asked Snyder, who was the most knowledgeable about formations. The Demolic had actually discovered this problem as well. However, after realizing the difference between himself and Elam, he did not dare to act rashly. If he damaged the other structures, this slight damage to the mice energy core might be even more serious. Of course, it was not that there was no way. After all, there were many unreasonable spells in the multiverse. If conventional methods were not enough to repair the mice energy core, then they could try unconventional methods. For example, the spell that the pit fiends could only use once a year, the wishing spell. It seemed very feasible. Ever since Keys had found a pit fiend to help him improve the engine of Traction City, he had liked this method. Now, he had more than 20 pit fiends under his command, excluding the 13 that had died. They could use the wishing spell more than 20 times, which should be enough to repair this slight damage to the mice energy core. After all, they already had a more accurate judgment as to where the problem was with the mice energy core. There was no need to give vague orders to the pit fiends and have them make vague wishes. However, to avoid trouble, Keys would definitely not tell them what it was that they had to make a wish to repair. He chose a safer method, gathering the pit fiends in batches and ordering them to make wishes to repair the network of mithril threads. In the end, after 5 wishes, the slight damage was completely repaired. The excited Demolic ignored his mental exhaustion and forcefully used legend proficiency once to confirm that the main functions of the mice energy core had been repaired. After spending an entire day, a smile finally appeared on Keys's face. His next plan had some more assurance. Graz, ZT, Buffett, the Tyrant Worm, and that fellow who wants to destroy Acid Fog Canyon. A good show is about to begin. You better not blink. The young blue dragon calculated for a while. He did not intend to let any of these fellows go. If they wanted to play, then they would play big. None of them would have an easy time. Chapter 538. It was undoubtedly an extremely difficult task to reorganize this mixed group of demons and mortals into an orderly manner. However, the ogre Brock, who was the quartermaster, and the desert elf Brock, who was the captain of the city guards, performed commendably. They counted all the supplies in detail, especially food and drinking water, and distributed them according to the number of people. Among the mortal mercenaries, some of the high-ranking guys expressed their dissatisfaction and felt that they should get more. However, when the law enforcers sent by Brock glared at them angrily, they immediately quieted down. Compared to the mortals in the city, the group of demon soldiers outside the city was much more disciplined. Except for the commanders of the Batsu Expeditionary Legion, who were forced by Key's power, the rest of the Batsu welcomed the formation of the Legion and the return of order. Those days were simply unbearable. A certain barbed demon guard captain dipped some tobacco from the human skin bag he carried with him and put it into the bone pipe in his mouth. A great opportunity has been wasted. Fortunately, Lord Cuz is now in charge of the situation again. Perhaps, but it would be better if his lordship didn't think so highly of those mortals, another demon who was familiar with him said. What can they do? Previously, they were only servants of the Megalosaurus. Now we don't even know where the Megalosaurus have gone. Traction City had been moving continuously for 2 days. Along the way, they encountered many earthquakes and avoided several volcanoes that suddenly emerged. Moreover, as the earth cracked, the gas that was originally deposited underground leaked out, and the acid fog canyon became full of sour gas. Although this was not an extreme environment for the demons, the group of mortal mercenaries in the city did not have such strong tolerance. They could only rely on the spellcasters to desperately purify the air, so that they did not have a large number of non-combat casualties. Therefore, after detecting the surrounding situation and finding that there was no obvious danger, Traction City finally stopped moving today. Many craftsmen wearing anti-acid amulets and pig-nose-style gas masks began to work on the fortress. They had to carry out damage control. Not only did they have to add an acid-resistant coating to the fortress, but they also had to add a set of distributed air purification system that covered the entire Traction City. Originally, it was very unwise to carry out such a huge modification project at this time. However, since yesterday, for some unknown reason, the workshop area in the center of the fortress had been operating at full capacity and crazily produced all kinds of magic creations. Things like anti-acid amulets and pig-nose-style gas masks were child's play. Many engineering constructs and even combat models of golems began to come off the production line frequently. Look, those megalosaurus! The two demons who were chatting just now suddenly looked up and saw figures appearing in the distant sky. With their excellent eyesight, they quickly recognized that it was actually a group of flying megalosaurus. But what surprised them was that the alarm bell in the city didn't ring for a long time, as though they weren't worried about the possible appearance of the enemy. That was indeed the case because the arrival of the dragons was part of Quest's plan. He had already informed Kryphia that they should gather all their forces in one place and prepare to deal with the counterattack that the two demon lords could launch at any time. Moreover, after learning that the plane source core was damaged, Kryphia had already guessed that there was a high probability that the Pentashade Dragon Queen had done it. Even if Tiamat didn't do it herself, it was definitely related to her. As the third generation of a god, she had a deep understanding of that person's craziness. She was very clear about that person's character. If he could achieve his goal, he wouldn't feel any heartache at all even if he had to sacrifice his bloodline descendant. She, who was out of her wits, could only rely on herself now. Allying with Keys was Kryphia's best choice. In particular, the other party had also promised that as long as she could complete the task of gathering the Megalosaurus army, he would send her out of the Acid Fog Canyon as a last resort so that Kryphia's debt wouldn't become a dead debt. She was meat on the chopping block. Kryphia had no other choice now. She could only place her hopes on the young blue dragon. She hoped that he would keep his promise due to his nature of order. Apart from that, her only thought was to end the upcoming battle as soon as possible. After all, she had waited for too long. She was afraid that there would be other unforeseen events. Don't be impatient. Standing on the balcony of the audience room, Keys sent a message to Kryphia to calm her down as he looked at the dragons that had landed around New Boom Town. The demons will appear tomorrow at the latest, no more than 15 hourglasses at the earliest. As long as you lead the dragons to join the battlefield when needed and help me secure victory, I will definitely fulfill my previous promise. I promise. I hope so. Kryphia's reply was very simple. She also had many things to do now. The most important thing was to fill the stomachs of the Pentashade Megalosaurus. After all, the war was about to begin. An excellent general would not let his soldiers go hungry at this time. Moreover, after the upcoming war, New Boom Town did not need to worry about logistics anymore. Therefore, Keys opened up his supply to the dragons. Of course, the food, the energy bricks made from the flesh of the acid mist worms and rich in protein, was definitely not that delicious by the standards of the Megalosaurus, but it won in large quantities. It would not be a problem for the dragons to eat it for an entire day. However, apart from the white dragons, most of the Megalosaurus would stop eating after they were full. They would not let their stomachs swell into a ball. Similar to the Megalosaurus, before the war, the mortal mercenaries of New Boom Town also enjoyed luxurious supplies and a long period of rest. Except for the most stubborn laborers in the labor camps, they would be squeezed dry of the last bit of their remaining value and undertake work several times more arduous than before. After their deaths, they would be made into soul prisms to make a final contribution to Keys's pockets. Now, the entire Traction City was in a state of relaxation on the outside but tension on the inside. Only Keyes was nervously assigning tasks to the former general's bateau. But to them, this situation was not unfamiliar. After all, many of them were veterans who had experienced several bloody battles and were actually quite knowledgeable about fighting demons. Lord Keyes, a demon general with scars all over his body, listened to the young blue dragon's military deployment. After thinking for a while, he asked doubtfully, "Why don't you let those mortal mercenaries be cannon fodder first? After all, even if they are expendable, those low-level Batsubrats are much more valuable than them?" Chapter 539. Faced with the demon general's question, Keyes only replied with one sentence, "Complete my orders, or die." To Batsu, this kind of answer was not unfamiliar. Even the demon general had once been a small soldier. Moreover, the long years of war had made these guys' tactical abilities very outstanding, so Keyes did not need to waste his breath. The tense and concise meeting lasted for half an hourglass before it ended. The demon generals hurriedly left. They would use their own methods to mobilize their subordinates before the war. In this regard, Quest didn't say anything more. After all, he had other things to do. The young blue dragon came to the workshop of the golems. It seemed like the production line had just been completed yesterday, but in fact, when the Bador Expeditionary Army was first recruited, this workshop had already started to carry out various preparations in accordance with the 007 model. The resources obtained from the other Bador fortresses were mostly used in this workshop. Almost all the mages in New Boom Town had participated in the work here. In order to increase work efficiency, all their spell slots would be filled with the same type of spell. Spells such as Instruction Spell, Construct Body, and Create Secondary Elemental Essence were all cast by mid-level and low-level mages, while spells such as Limited Wish Spell and Transform All Things were given to high-level mages to complete. Originally, Keyes had planned to have him and Snade cast spells together at the last moment, casting the Activate Body Construct spell on all the semi-finished golems, thus summoning a large enough golem army at once. However, with the mice energy nucleus, they did not need to waste this part of the power. They only needed to add a process at the end of the production line, which was to engrave the Activate Body Construct magic circle on the golems. As long as they were within the radiation range of the mice energy nucleus, the golems engraved with the magic circle would be able to operate normally. The only downside was that the range of attack of the golems was reduced, and they could not cross the boundary of the radiation range of the mice energy nucleus. Otherwise, it would only take a very short time for them to turn back into semi-finished golems, and there would be no way for them to pose any threat to the enemy. However, the golems were originally a type of defensive construct. In Keyes' strategy, they were mainly used for defense and counterattack. As long as they could withstand the demon army's frontal assault, these golems would not fail their mission. We mainly make flesh golems, clay golems, and iron golems here. Since Shay was busy renovating Traction City, Snade took charge of the golem workshop and introduced it to Keyes. In addition, there are 10 clockwork golems with higher intelligence. Thanks to Mr. Shay's help, he compiled a command program for them. They are responsible for commanding the surrounding golems according to the actual situation on the battlefield. After hearing Snade's introduction, Keyes nodded with satisfaction. According to the previous report, the golem workshop had already produced about 3,000 golems. In the next 10 hourglasses there would be another 1,000 or so golems coming off the production line. Even after the battle, as long as Traction City did not fall, the golem workshop could still produce and repair golems for at least 2 days. When the golem workshop was first built, due to the limitations of materials and resources, Keyes and Snade originally intended to produce dozens of high-level steel golems, or more high-end adamantine golems or mithril golems to supplement the combat power of New Boom Town. However, after collecting a large amount of materials from the Bateau Expeditionary Army and obtaining the mice energy nucleus, he decisively changed his mind and began to mass-produce flesh golems, clay golems, and iron golems. He was ready to win by quantity. Due to Snade's traditional craftsmanship and relatively low manufacturing costs, the flesh and blood golems were still the ones that came out of the golem workshop the most. These golems were about 8 feet tall to 5 meters, and weighed about 500 pounds, 450 pounds. As the name implied, they were assembled from corpses that had not yet fully decomposed. Each flesh golem required at least 6 corpses, some special ointment, thick ropes and metal nails to stitch up the corpses, as well as bandages to reinforce the stitched parts. The corpses of the flesh golems were made from the corpses of the villains who had died in the penal camps, so the cost was almost zero. Keyes looked carefully and found a few familiar faces. For example, the wild boar man Roadhog, who had colluded with foreign enemies, had been made into a flesh golem with a relatively large body. Also, Snade said that because the brain of that guy was fresh and had a strong desire to survive, as well as good luck, the flesh and blood demon golem with Road Bully as its main body retained part of its intelligence and could use some of its combat skills when it was alive. Is it possible that they will betray us at the last minute? Keyes could not help but ask. He did not want to see any uncontrollable situation, because it was more troublesome to deal with such problems on the battlefield. Apparently, Snade had been prepared for this and answered methodically. In fact, after entering a battle, flesh golems may go berserk and attack nearby living creatures indiscriminately. However, like all golems, flesh golems are also immune to control and illusion spells, so the enemy cannot use this to affect them. Fire and cold spells are effective, but except for some particularly powerful spells, other spells can only slow down their movements. As for the electric shock spell, it was a great tonic for the flesh and blood demon golems. Not only could it heal their injuries, but it could also increase their speed. The clockwork golems were equipped with small taser guns, which could fire electric shocks similar to the effect of static shock. As long as the flesh golems showed signs of going berserk or rebelling, they would shoot them with the taser guns. This had already been written into the command program of the clockwork golems by Shea. After being electrocuted, the flesh golems could not turn around at all. They could only speed up and charge into the ranks of the demon army. At that time, even if they go berserk, it will only be beneficial to us. Anyway, flesh golems are just consumables, and they can kill and injure the demon army. You should have noticed that I also added a lot of spikes to their fists to make them more deadly when they go berserk. After hearing Snade's explanation, Keyes felt that there was nothing wrong with it. He walked to the flesh golem with Roadhog as its main body and patted its arm. It's up to you on the battlefield. Let's see how you can help the enemy this time. Ha ha. Chapter 540. Good times were always short, even if there was seaweed to eat. Moreover, New Boom Town did not have such food rations. Although Brew had sent a lot of soft-fried acid mist worms, barbecue, honey bread, and jam, Jason still distributed these high-end food to his subordinates, the mercenaries who had converted to the path of the sacred samurai under his influence. He just took a protein brick, dipped it in a plate of salt, and drank light beer. He chewed the food in small bites, and then slowly swallowed it into his stomach. The experience of participating in the bloody battle in the bottomless abyss had changed him a lot. From the initial confusion and bewilderment of destroying more demons, Jason's belief had changed to being responsible to his companions. Objectively speaking, Keyes and his other companions did not belong to the good camp. But Jason found that not only was he not betrayed by the power of virtue, but the surging holy power in his body clearly told him that the power of virtue approved of his actions. So he was very calm. But now the environment outside New Boom Town was completely different from the sacred samurai's state of mind. The raging storm was still blowing, and the sound of the wind was getting louder and louder. On the upper level of the city, a few empty houses were blown down, and some houses even lost their roof. Two of Shay's workers ventured out to nail a loose deck on the city wall at the front of the city, but they were blown up into the sky together with the deck. Fortunately, they were dragged by safety ropes like heavy kites. After the tireless efforts of a few blood-armored demons, they were finally dragged back to the air raid shelter on the city wall. A few bruises and exhaustion caused by the secretion of adrenaline were not fatal. Because of the storm outside, the core area of Traction City became busier. It was located above the intestine of the city. The thundering roar of engines reverberated. Smoke and steam made the place hazy. Railroad tracks and elevator shafts crisscrossed the place. Hurry up and increase the pressure on the third auxiliary gate. We must keep the wind facing the same direction as the storm. Shay, who was in charge of controlling the core area, ordered loudly. At the same time, he silently cursed the sudden gust of wind. When the inclination angle reaches 13 degrees, immediately lower the 8 supports on the base. Following his orders, Traction City began to rotate on the spot. The high-pressure steam ejected from the booster port provided additional vectors for this mobile stronghold, while the 8 support frames lowered from the base penetrated deep into the ground to maintain stability. Thanks to his calm command, the huge Traction City was not blown away by the strong winds. As for the Devil Army gathered outside the city, they had an artificial safe haven because of the Traction City in front of them. They didn't need to expend more energy to maintain their defensive spells. And this point was actually very crucial. Half an hourglass ago, although the earthquakes and volcanic eruptions in the Acid Fog Canyon Plain were still ongoing, the new boom town was actually not too affected. All the soldiers were eating and sleeping as usual. The sudden gust of wind was out of everyone's expectations. It was almost certain that this storm had something to do with the demon army. They might have been waiting for the storm to exhaust the Bartho Expeditionary Army so that they could take the opportunity to launch an attack. But in fact, the demon army had no such intention. It was because their commander couldn't wait any longer, and the half-demons, minotaurs, and worm demons were the same. Therefore, the whistling wind carried their exuberant anger as they galloped in the direction of Traction City. Enemy detected. Confirmed to be the demon army. Confirmed to be the demon army. Distance 10 parsecs from Traction City. Received, please return. The clockwork scout hidden in the soil was ruthlessly crushed by a huge ox hoof that fell from the sky. Its spider-like body exploded in an instant, and all kinds of parts shot out. After the electric current broke the circuit, there was a hissing sound as if it was describing the enemy that had just been discovered. The giant ox demon snorted and continued to walk alone in the violent wind. As the vanguard of the demon army, they had to rely on their eyes that could see through traps and invisible targets for the following troops to find and clean up these small eyes. At this time, the giant ox demon wanted to raise its head and shout, but it had to obey the silent command given by its creator. The desire for the upcoming battle, as well as the fear of Lord Buffett, made it feel tormented, and its rationality was about to be eroded. However, what he didn't know was that there was another eye around him. It was the ruby eyeball that the clockwork scout had shot out earlier. It was scattered in a cluster of snake trees and quietly recorded his image. Then, it used the remaining energy in the eyeball to send out an encrypted radio wave. "It's Buffett," Keyes said in a deep voice as he sat in the audience room with his hands on the table and looked at the image projected on the crystal screen in front of him. "Everyone, prepare for battle. Inform Snade to prepare to let the road robbers out of their cages to receive the guests." The alarm bell in New Boomtown began to ring. Along the brass sound transmission pipes, 4 long and 3 short bell rings were transmitted to every unit. Whether it was the technicians in the core area, the laborers suffering in the intestines of the city, or the mercenaries from the other planes who were ready for battle, everyone knew that a great battle was about to begin. However, the demon's army reacted the fastest. The Batsu demons were known for their strict discipline, and their reaction after receiving the enemy's information showed this point incisively and vividly. Without any superfluous words, all the demons silently arrived at their post. The wind has weakened. The distance is less than 3 parsangs. Keys immediately ordered Shay, who was operating Traction City, after summing up the real-time data and calculating in his mind. Adjust the air pressure at the gate. The first batch of the Golem army will be launched. 10:9 The reason why Keys needed to inform Shay in advance was that this launch was not as simple as opening the gate of Traction City and releasing the golems to fight. Instead, it was in the form of a human cannon, using steam catapults to launch the golems to the target location. Most of the golems selected as the first batch to enter the battlefield were made of flesh and blood. They were placed in sealed crates filled with withered grass. Then, they were propelled by the exhaust gas from the engine of Traction City's core. With a muffled bang, they suddenly shot out. In the first batch, a total of 500 golems were selected. As if a string of firecrackers had been set off, crates of the same size flew into the sky one after another, and then fell rapidly. The giant bull demons that Buffett had arranged to be in the vanguard position, as well as the worm demons that followed behind the giant bull demons, heard the sounds of the golems being released from Traction City. At the same time, they also saw the crates falling from the sky. Many of the demons had doubts in their hearts. What's that? Chapter 541. As long as one breathed in a wisp of the acidic dust, it would feel as if a file had been placed in one's throat, causing them to spit out large amounts of bloody, frothy sputum. Fortunately, Roadhog was no longer a wild boar-man barbarian warrior. Now it was a flesh and blood golem. It had flesh and blood, but it didn't need to breathe. The pain of breathing was already far away from it. Roadhog shook off the withered grass and cork on its body and stood up straight from the broken crate. Around it, many flesh and blood golems were doing the same thing. The flesh and blood golems were similar to the slightly smaller mountain giants, but their skin was sickly green or yellowish-brown, which was a thick shell formed after the skin of the corpses had been dissolved by a special ointment. Before being released, the flesh and blood golems had been implanted with the command to attack the demons. Therefore, after climbing out of the broken crate, they began to search for the demons. The flesh and blood golems that flew further away found the advancing worm demons and rushed toward them without thinking. Those that landed closer naturally pounced on the giant bull demons. Roadhog belonged to the latter group. His target was a giant bull demon. After seeing his target, he didn't evaluate the difference in strength and size between them. Instead, he revealed his habitual hideous smile. His huge feet stepped on the soft and dry ground of the acid fog canyon, producing dull footsteps. As he stepped forward, the iron ring on his neck began to emit crackling static electricity. As the first batch of golems to be released, since there were no clockwork golems to supervise them, they could only use the simplest restraining measures. Snader put an iron collar on each of the flesh and blood golems, on which was engraved an electrostatic tremor magic circle. As long as they carried out the command to attack the demons, the collar would constantly emit static electricity within the radiation range of the mice energy nucleus. Stimulated by the static electricity, all the flesh and blood golems, including Roadhog, became faster and faster. They no longer staggered as they had when they first landed. Instead, they became more agile. Annoying undead. The giant bull demon Learben's nose twitched. He smelled the scent of corpses coming from the hill giants that were charging at him, so he mistook the flesh golems as undead. Unlike mortals, demons were not afraid of the undead at all, unless they were especially powerful and limited. Many demons had mastered the technique of berating the undead, and they would occasionally subdue some undead for their own use. However, Lurben didn't know how to cast spells. Or rather, giant bull demons generally disdained to learn spells other than spells. With their huge size and unrivaled strength, they had a better choice to deal with the undead creatures. Stomp! Lurben stomped his foot on the ground, and an irresistible force was transmitted into the ground through his hooves. With him as the center, within a radius of about 80 feet, the ground began to crack and tremble violently. Many flesh and blood golems that were charging at him lost their balance due to the sudden earthquake and fell to the ground. They tried to stand up, but no matter how hard they tried, they still couldn't move. However, Roadhog didn't fall because it used its own method to maintain its balance. The moment Lurben stomped his foot, Roadhog threw out the hook on its broken arm and hooked onto the giant bull demon's navel. As if it was still angry, Roadhog took advantage of Lurben's pain and pulled back the hook on its broken arm. Then, Roadhog threw itself at the giant bull demon's body. "You're courting death." Feeling the pain, Lurben became even more ferocious. He reached out his hand and pulled off the hook on his navel. He exerted strength with one arm, and the speed at which Roadhog flew towards him increased by a few notches. Then, he clenched his other fist and prepared to give Roadhog a head-on punch. However, Roadhog, who was flying in the air, didn't panic in the face of danger. Under the continuous static tremor, Roadhog's agility had reached the maximum threshold that its body could withstand. It was precisely because of this that Roadhog could complete the movement of twisting its waist in the air. Not only did it dodge Lurben's heavy punch by a hair's breadth, but it also took the opportunity to step on Lurben's arm and threw itself at the giant bull demon's shocked face like an arrow released from a bow. Splat! The double-edged dagger stabbed into the bull demon's eye. A cruel and ferocious expression appeared on the Roadhog's face. It pushed the dagger deeper into the bull demon's eye and then pulled it out with all its might. Using the dagger and the iron nail that was embedded in its arm, it pulled Lurben's eyeball out. Crack! The giant bull demon was also extremely domineering. It didn't even cry out in pain when its eyeballs were pulled out. Instead, it opened its mouth and bit down on the road tyrant's fat body, trying to tear it apart. Although the flesh and blood golem had a layer of tough skin, it wasn't a high-quality product after all. It wasn't as indestructible as the adamantine golems and mithril golems. Under the giant bull demon's all-out attack, a small portion of the Roadhog's body was torn off with a single bite. However, something that the giant bull demon would never forget happened. This flesh golem that looked like an undead actually had the liquefied gas of the stinky cloud spell sealed in its body. The stench that went straight to the top of Lurben's head made him feel as if he had sucked the blood of a Hezru. He immediately vomited. This also gave the other flesh and blood golems, not the Roadhog, because it had indeed lost most of its flesh and blood. It was so badly injured that it could not stand up again. The earthquake caused by Lurben had disappeared. They all rushed over and began to attack the giant bull demon who was vomiting on the ground. Looking at the other flesh golems carrying out their atrocities, Roadhog's face once again showed a rather personal expression. It was a little envious of the other flesh golems. Therefore, this eccentric and crazy guy actually used the hook to wedge himself into the ground and slowly dragged himself to Lurben. "I can beat you down by myself," Roadhog yelled crazily as it used its hook to hit the iron collar on its neck. "Then, I'll send you on your way." An octopus-like tentacle stretched out from the outside of the collar, then quickly pierced into its neck and connected to the wires buried inside. Bang! Chapter 542. An explosion suddenly occurred. Electric sparks traveled along the connected wires and detonated the brick explosives on the body of the Roadhog. The entire flesh and blood demon golem was burned to ashes in the loud explosion. The giant bull devil Leirbender naturally suffered another fierce blow. Of course, this level of explosion still couldn't kill the strong giant bull demon. The impact of the explosion also squeezed his chest and abdomen, which accelerated his vomiting of the liquefied stinky cloud spell. He was finally able to use his spell-like ability. Many creatures in the lower world had the ability to regenerate, but it was very rare to see a creature like the giant bull demon who could use high-speed regeneration as a spell-like ability. However, from this point it could be seen how extraordinary their high-speed regeneration ability was. Calming himself down, Lurban activated high-speed regeneration, and the wounds inside and outside of his body began to heal quickly. According to his own estimation, it would take him at most 60 breaths to heal all the wounds on his body without leaving any hidden dangers. "You damn minced meat, Before he could finish his trash talk, something terrifying happened. The iron collars on the necks of the flesh and blood demon golems that were besieging him suddenly flashed with bright electric sparks. After a series of crackling sounds, they all followed in the footsteps of the road hog. No. The blazing flames engulfed the giant bull demon, and the shockwave tore his body apart. The demon that was as tall as a 10-story building instantly withered. Even if he had the ability of high-speed regeneration, he still couldn't save his shattered body, let alone save his own life. Including that road hog, a total of 6 flesh demon golems started the self-destruct program, and they worked together to kill a giant bull demon. Sitting in the audience room, Quest looked at the crystal screen on the desk, which displayed the real-time synchronized data projected by Snade. If you want to create and tame a giant bull demon, after converting the resources required, you can create 3,000 flesh demon golems. So, the loss ratio between us and the demon army is about 1:500. 1:500. This loss ratio was already very low. If the cost of creating the giant bull demon was included, the loss ratio would be even lower. However, after seeing the result, Keyes and Snade were not blindly optimistic, at least not for now. This was because they knew very well that the Abyss never lacked demons. In a blood war, if the demons wanted to gain a partial advantage, they had to ensure that their losses were less than 100. However, this was a requirement for the high morale and strict discipline of the Batsu elite army. Moreover, it was based on the perfect logistical support provided by the 9 prisons of Bader. With the motley crew that Keyes had gathered, as well as the limited war resources, if he wanted to win this war in a short period of time, the casualty ratio would be at least 1:300. At the same time, there was another factor that needed to be considered. Although the magic golems were fearless, the Batsu and mortal mercenaries might not be able to do the same. Therefore, on the local battlefield, there was a lot of exaggeration in this impressive number of 1:500. If they could not increase their killing efficiency and compete with the demons, Keyes' army might not be able to hold on, and it would be difficult to secure the final victory. Prepare to release the second batch of magic golems. At least 1 clockwork magic golem will be needed as a commander. Increase the power of the steam ejection device. We must send those magic golems to the demon army. At the same time, let the Megalosaurus army prepare to attack. The giant bull demons will be left to them. After quickly cleaning them up, let the dragons quickly retreat to Traction City. After thinking for a while, Keyes immediately issued a new order. The situation on the battlefield was constantly changing. He could only rely on his intuition and experience to quickly make judgments, and then continue to make mistakes. From Keyes' point of view, Buffett sent the giant bull demons as the vanguard. He obviously wanted to make use of the individual advantage of these giant demons and let them be the arrowhead of the demon army's infiltration tactics. Therefore, Keyes chose to use the flexible defense tactic, using the dragons that had both mobility and individual strength to clean up this group of giant bull demons. In addition, if the demon army wanted to use the infiltration tactics, in addition to the necessary arrowhead, they would definitely have to deploy a large number of troops on the flanks as support. According to the experience of the demons for millions of years, even if demons were chaotic and disorderly creatures, as long as there was a demon lord overseeing them, they would still have some wisdom most of the time. They would not use the extremely stupid tactic of adding fuel to the fire just because they had the advantage in numbers. Therefore, after arranging for the dragons to carry out the flexible defense, Keyes immediately issued another order. Notify the artillery positions on Traction City and have all the cannoneers immediately load ammunition. Ensure that the 3,200 Hellscream cannons can suppress the barrage at least twice. The estimated impact point is set to be the first area, and the ammunition will be special cannonballs filled with silver powder. With the implementation of the order, the entire Traction City became busy. A large number of laborers were driven to the front lines by the Bone Demon supervisors. With the help of the engineering constructs, they quickly transferred the Hellscream cannonballs from the ammunition depot to the artillery positions on the city wall. At the same time, Shea, who was in the core engine area, also personally operated the steam ejection device. After raising the pressure by 2 standard units, he released the second batch of golems. One of the crates was particularly large because it contained a clockwork magic golem as well as some matching combat modules. The crate fell to the ground, and after a dull thud, it turned into fragments. This clockwork golem was vaguely recognizable as a human. It suddenly came to life, emitting an ear-piercing spinning sound and the clicking sound caused by hundreds of gears turning. It had thick lower limbs, and its feet were equipped with metal claws to ensure that it could grab the ground. At the end of its 2 arms were 2 huge fists, and there were also gauntlets on them that were obviously not just for decorative purposes, making them appear even heavier. On the surface of its body, there were many gaps, and looking from the outside, one could see a large number of rotating sawteeth and spokes. If caught by the clockwork golem, these sawteeth and spokes would immediately extend and forcibly twist the opponent into paste. When this huge monster appeared, a small commotion broke out in the demon army. Many worm demons who thought they were strong began to charge at it, wanting to use violent means to forcibly dismantle this annoying construct. Facing the impulsive demons, the clockwork golem that was implanted with a combat program immediately switched to a form suitable for combat. 2 huge fists reached down and grabbed the barrels of 2 Hellscream cannons, one on the left and one on the right, easily holding them in their hands. Authorized to fire. Chapter 543. With the mice energy core, the greatest benefit was that it was much easier to enchant objects. As long as the spell was not too advanced, within the radiation range of the mice energy core, it would still be effective even if the formation was drawn on something that was not suitable for enchantment. Now, there were 3 small formations on the inner walls of the 2 barrels of Hellscream in the hands of the clockwork golem. 2 of them were temporary magic pockets, and the other one was an electric trap that had been weakened by a lot. The 2 magic pockets, one at the front and one at the back, would open every 5 breaths. They were responsible for filling the cannon powder and the warhead, respectively. Then, the cannon powder would be ignited by electric sparks and complete the firing action. Bang! Bang! After 2 consecutive gunshots, a large amount of iron sand flew out of the 2 barrels. These iron sand had been specially processed and plated with a layer of silver on the outside. It was quite lethal to the demons of the lower realm, and the demons that usually did not have any armor hated it even more. The barrage of bullets stuck to the worm demons that were charging over. Those with slightly weaker physiques were directly turned into sieves and fell to the ground. Those with better physiques were not directly put down, but they also let out miserable howls and stopped their charging steps one after another. Of course, there were also those who were more stubborn, such as a simple-looking Hezru. Strictly speaking, Hezru that were parasitized by the acid mist worms were not real Hezru. They were actually worm demons now. According to the imagination of the worm tyrant, the acid mist worms it created had a parasitic possession ability. They could corrode the host's body and eventually forcibly occupy it. In this process, the host's various attributes would be weakened to varying degrees, and even part of their innate spell-like abilities would be lost. However, when the acid mist worms succeeded in possession, the host would completely become a worm demon. Other than losing their spell-like abilities, their other attributes would slowly recover as the worm demons devoured each other. Moreover, since other worm demons also inherited part of their host's spell-like abilities, after devouring a large number of worm demons of other species, there was a high probability that the worm demons would also inherit part of their host's spell-like abilities. Therefore, if one wanted to deal with the demon worm, knowing only certain demonic knowledge was not enough. Although they looked like some kind of demons, they could release another kind of spell that only demons could master at any time. The Hezru that was shot by the clockwork golem at close range had lost its ability to fight back because it had the giant bull demon's super regeneration ability. In fact, although the silver-plated iron sand was very painful when it hit the body, the wounds quickly healed. Seeing that the Hezru was still charging at it, the clockwork golem immediately changed the target of its firepower. It gathered the 2 barrels of Hellscream in one place and focused fire on the big toad. The demon seemed to have become smarter. It used its hands to protect its head, bent its body, and aimed its armored back, which was covered in wet scales, at the muzzle of the clockwork golem. Then, it charged forward ferociously without caring about anything else. On his ugly face that was covered by his palms, his insect-like eyes revealed an excited glint. He panted heavily with his mouth full of sharp teeth and stuck out his tongue from time to time. Teleportation. After suffering a few more attacks, the Hezru suddenly launched a spell-like ability as if it had already calculated in its heart. It had just been confusing the clockwork golem, trying to make it ignore its teleportation ability. Then, it would be able to go behind it and launch a terrifying and fatal surprise attack. Its thick arms were now strangling the clockwork golem's neck. The Hezru's arms swelled up, and its muscles suddenly exerted strength, intending to execute a removal decapitation on the golem's head. However, something unexpected happened. Although the clockwork golem had made some mistakes in its judgment just now, the move that was close to the attack was actually written in its combat program. Sawtooth mode. The clockwork golem opened its palms and let the 2 Hellscream fall to the ground. Its body began to transform. First, it bent its elbow joints backward and grabbed the Hezru with its 2 arms in reverse. Then, it suddenly squatted down, and its armor suddenly shrank inwards. The saw-teeth in its body popped out one after another and spun crazily. Ah! Before the Hezru could escape, thousands of saw-teeth tore its body apart, dissecting this fully evolved worm demon into pieces of minced meat that were only the size of a fist. Grease. After completing the dismemberment, the clockwork golem automatically activated the magic array engraved in its core in order to prevent the minced meat and bone fragments from affecting the operation of the machine. A large amount of magic grease surged out from the core of the clockwork golem, completely soaking its body. With a creaking sound and the lubrication of the grease, the clockwork golem returned to its original state at an even faster speed. It activated another magic array in its body, and flames came out layer by layer from the inside out, igniting the excess grease on its body. Standing in place, its body burning with raging flames, the clockwork golem at this time was like a god that was ready to take revenge on the demons. In fact, it was indeed doing so. It squatted down and picked up another set of weapon modules, which was a cylinder made of several staves tied together. Then, it turned its head 360 degrees to get a clear picture of the situation on the battlefield. Static tremor. In an instant, a large amount of bright electric sparks shot out from the tip of the staves in its hand. However, this was not to attack the demons, but to spur those flesh and blood golems. This was because in the presence of the clockwork golem, the task of commanding the flesh and blood golems would be completed by the former. Therefore, unlike the first batch, Although the second batch of flesh and blood golems also had iron collars around their necks, these collars only had the function of guiding them to self-destruct at the end, and would not continuously shock them and recharge them. At this time, the second batch of more than 500 flesh and blood golems were like reefs in the wave. They gradually gathered in one place, jointly resisting the worm demons that were constantly attacking them. Spurred by the clockwork golem, their speed instantly increased by a lot. Many flesh and blood golems that were already covered in wounds quickly scabbed over and healed after being electrocuted. Some of the flesh and blood golems that were focused on by the clockwork golems could no longer control themselves and began to launch counterattacks against the demon army. They rushed to the place where the worm demons were gathered, using their shoulders, teeth, fists, and swords tied to their hands to fiercely swing around, crazily spreading boundless anger that made the demons' scalps numb. If they encountered demons that they could not defeat and the flesh and blood golems were seriously damaged, they would launch a suicidal charge. After charging in front of the demons, they would explode into a fireball with a boom. Chapter 544. The flesh and blood golems encountered layers upon layers of obstruction from the demon army and had to stop their offensive, falling into a stalemate with the enemy. They could not continue to advance the front line, and the demons could not approach the new boom town. Due to the continuous absorption of the mice energy nuclei, the energy index in the surrounding environment gradually decreased, so similar to the situation on the battlefield. The originally extremely fierce wind gradually began to subside. In the confrontation on the battlefield, as the commander, Buffett did not take the lead, but chose to watch the battle from the flank. When he saw the torch-like clockwork golem and the flesh and blood golems led by it resist the demon worm army with only a few hundred people, the demon lord's originally dark face became darker. "Those worms are a bunch of trash." In his plan, there were 20 Megalosaurus demons as the vanguard. Although these demon worms were not very useful, they were not a problem as a support force for surprise attacks and infiltration. As long as the Megalosaurus demons tore a hole in the enemy's front line, they could swarm in and completely tear the enemy's front line through those holes. But who would have thought that before they could get close to Traction City, the demon worm army would be blocked in place, and could not move forward at all. Moreover, those demon worms seemed to only use the tactic of adding fuel to the fire. They did not have any experience in fighting on the battlefield and seemed very amateurish. "I can't let the boys fight with their lives anymore. The trash can't keep up. Even if they rush over, they will only be giving the enemy a victory." After all, it was a creation that he was more satisfied with. Buffett actually favored the Megalosaurus demons very much. Moreover, these more than 20 Megalosaurus demons were a trump card in his hand for this trip to the Acid Fog Canyon. There was no need for them to be wasted here. Just now, the Tauran king saw that a Megalosaurus demon named Lurban had died in battle. He was besieged and then killed by the opponent's suicide attack. However, Buffett had a special prediction, and Keyes had already predicted his prediction. As soon as the order to retreat was given, the Megalosaurus demons had just turned their heads, and the elastic defense of Traction City had already arrived. More than 50 Megalosaurus, whose average age was at least that of an old dragon, passed through the clouds above Traction City and suddenly launched a swift and cruel attack on the colossal bull demons that were preparing to retreat. Due to the suppression of strength and numbers, apart from an elderly black dragon whose belly was cut by the horns of the Megalosaurus, the rest of the Megalosaurus were basically unharmed. They only needed to launch a single attack to wipe out 20 Megalosaurus. Order, death. Increased spell range. Rotten sack explosion. Although he didn't have the feeling of seeing his son die before him, losing a trump card still made Buffett's heart ache. The infuriated demon lord was filled with killing intent, and he did not hesitate to kill the injured black dragon. As expected, the old black dragon, who was already heavily injured, didn't even have the time to spread his wings before he lost the chance to fly. After his death, the dragon's corpse instantly rotted and then burst into a violent explosion. The other megalosaurus fled back to the cloud. "You bunch of... Don't surround that bunch of trash." A pink acid mist worm appeared in the hand of the furious Tauran king. He ordered in exasperation, "Rely on the advantage of the legion's numbers and advance towards that fortress immediately." After that, he was too lazy to explain anything and threw the pink acid mist worm to the ground. The strangely colored worm disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye, and after a few breaths, it appeared in the hands of a cataclysm worm group, perfectly repeating the order. The Tauran king's abuse made the cataclysm worm group angry, but because of the tyrant worm's previous instructions, they had to follow Buffett's instructions to dispatch the army. Thanks to the intervention of the cataclysm worm group, the chaotic demon worms quickly adjusted their target. They no longer only cared about destroying the two groups of golems that had been released from Traction City. Instead, they divided a small number of troops to surround them, while the rest continued to charge in the direction of Traction City. And all of this had already been seen through by Keys. He just tapped twice on the crystal screen on the desk and gave the artillery positions on the city wall the right to fire freely according to the original plan. In an instant, more than 3,200 Hellroars opened fire at the same time, letting out a deafening roar. They were divided into 3 rows. There were 1,200 on the wide wall at the top of the fortress, and there were 2 floors below, each with 1,000 cannons. Due to the need to consider the shooting angle of the lower 2 floors, in order to achieve a longer range, they used silver-plated projectiles that weighed about 12 pounds each. Each projectile had a wire inside it that could explode at a distance of about 1,500 yards. Because the shooting angle of the upper floor could be adjusted to about 45 degrees, and it also had the advantage of height, the range of the Hellroars was much higher than that of the lower 2 floors with the same amount of cannon. Therefore, the first shell fired by the Hellroars on this floor was the chain shell of the scattershot shells. The 2 weights of this shell were connected by a silver-plated iron chain between the 2 connecting rods. After being fired, it could rotate and cause terrible cutting damage to the enemy. The first salvo, more than 3,200 shells, poured down on the demon army at once. The demon worms that were hit by the cannons were directly beaten to a pulp. As they ran, they would find that their companions in front of them disappeared into thin air. Then, the same doubts would appear in the hearts of their companions behind them. Don't be stingy with your spell-like abilities, hurry up and use teleportation to quickly pass through this damned area. The Cataclysm Worm group in charge of commanding the demon worms shouted from behind the demon army. However, their prediction was also predicted by the cannoneers of New Boom Town. Lower the shooting angle by 1 unit. Because they were immune to fire damage, the Batsu cannoneers directly operated and quickly lowered the shooting angle of the Hellroars before clearing the barrels and continuing to reload. The demon worms with teleportation had just crossed a large distance and assumed that they had already dodged the cannons. They were looking forward to rushing into New Boom Town and enjoying the slaughter while ridiculing the weak ones who didn't have the ability to teleport. However, the super rumble that had fused 3,200 rumbles sounded once again. The shells that flew out of the Hellroars once again fell on the demon worms' heads. This time, it was the guys who had teleported some distance ahead that were covered. Their ridicule now became even more sarcastic. Chapter 545. To break the stalemate on the battlefield, using cannons had always been a good method. And from the beginning of its invention, it was not only a defensive weapon, but it could also be used for offense. Start the engine, move forward at second-level speed, maintain stability. Keys continued to pay attention to the situation on the battlefield, and once again decisively issued an order. Attack together with the combat troops, rely on Traction City, kill all the demon scum that tries to rush over. If Traction City was compared to a tank, then it was much larger than the rat tank that Keyes knew in his previous life. And because of the large number of cannons, this tank was also a veritable multi-turret type. Coupled with its speed that was faster than a galloping horse, only the Batsu warriors were competent enough to coordinate with it. The so-called cooperative forces referred to the Bateau Expeditionary Army that had been recruited by Quest. There was only one requirement for them: always leave the front and the assault to Bateau City. As for the flanks, rear, underground, and even the sky, they must all watch over everything. The mission seemed a bit unreasonable, but the demons felt that the young Blue Dragon's arrangement was quite humane. In fact, throughout the history of the Blood War, the number of times that the commander of the Batsu Expeditionary Army was directly in charge of the front battle could be counted on one hand. Most of the time, the Batsu Expeditionary Army would let the small soldiers charge at the front and use them as cannon fodder. Even if they achieved a complete victory in the end, they would rarely be remembered for their achievements. One could imagine how excited the group of veterans in the lower world would be when they heard that they no longer needed to be cannon fodder. For the glory of Sir Keyes. Stragglers, demote. Adventurers, demote. According to the division of the guard area, let the demons enter Traction City. The captain of the squad, demote. All squad members will be beheaded. As the combat troops set out, thanks to the nature of the Batsu people's order, the strict and clear military orders were quickly imprinted in the demons' minds. They did not have the courage to disagree because mutiny would directly be demoted to inferior demons. For the demons, demotion was the most terrible punishment, and there had never been one like it. Even death could not compare to it. So in addition to being emotional, they also remained in awe and were ready to teach the demons a lesson. Slaughter the dregs of those insects. The tracks of the Traction City rotated forward, making muffled rumbling sounds. The hot steam discharged from the core engine covered the area with a layer of mist. The fighting spirit of Batsu's soldiers soared. Their battle roars resounded through the sky and even shattered the accumulated clouds. In contrast, the situation of the Devil Army was not so optimistic. The barrage of Hellscream had forcefully stopped the Fiend Worm's charge. Nearly 10,000 fiends had turned into cannon fodder in the blink of an eye. Even if the demon army was massive, and even if they were limited by the terrain, there were still millions of demons and worms participating in the battle. At the same time, the cataclysmic worms were supervising the battle from the rear. But how many more rounds of bombardment could they withstand? 30 rounds, 40 rounds, or 50 rounds? After all, the Calamity Swarm was not the Tyrant Worm. If half of the Devil Legion died, they would most likely collapse on their own. At that time, he could only let Buffett take action personally, relying on his formidable strength as a demon lord to strive to turn the tide. But would he? The Acid Fog Canyon Plain was the Tyrant Worm's territory. The Tauren King had come here only for revenge. He would not consider the interests of the Fiend Worm at all. Therefore, the Calamity Swarm did not actually trust the Demon Lord. Due to the Tyrant Worm's instructions, they had to listen to his orders for the time being. Retreat. At the rear, retreat 10 miles and focus on building the Nest Fortress and Crypt defense line. Unable to withstand the pressure, the Cataclysm Swarm finally abandoned Buffett's order and issued a new order to the Demon Worms. At the front, perform the devouring ritual and create temporary acid mist giant worms to resist the attack of the fortress. According to their thinking, the Devil Legion, which had fallen into a stalemate due to the bombardment and the obstruction of the Golem army, had now become a part of the force that had to be abandoned. Instead of being wasted in vain, it was better to let them carry out the devouring ritual and fuse into the acid fog worms that had little intelligence but were powerful. They would become higher-level cannon fodder. The Fiend Worm in the rear could take this opportunity to retreat to a safer place and build a fortress defense system. When the Traction City, which had consumed part of its power, arrived, they could defend and counterattack. It was just that they had miscalculated two conditions. First, with Keyes's current resources, if he allowed the artillery position to suppress the fiend worm, let alone 50 rounds, even 10 rounds would be insufficient for the Traction City's reserves of ammunition. Therefore, he ordered the Traction City to launch an assault and crush the fiend worm instead of continuing the artillery suppression. Therefore, Keyes could not let the Devil Legion retreat. Second, the fiend worm was chaotic by nature. Even if the Calamity Swarm could control most of the fiend worm, it was still very difficult to organize this kind of tail-cutting and defensive counterattack strategy. The retreating fiend worm and the fiend worm in the front where the ritual needed to be held were now intertwined. It would take a lot of time to separate them. Therefore, when Buffett observed the fiend worm's movements, the Tauren King stomped his feet and cursed again. Useless fools, these worms are even stupider than ghouls. They even took the initiative to give up their advantage in numbers. If it were not for the fact that it was not a good time for internal strife, he really wanted to wipe out the Calamity Swarm. Even if it was not beneficial to the outcome of the battle, it could at least appease some of the anger in his heart. Listen to my orders. Buffett pressed his temples that were constantly swelling due to congestion. He suppressed his emotions and ordered the half-demon Tauren standing behind him. When the moving fortress is crowded with the fiend worm, immediately rise into the air and use teleportation spells to break into its artillery position and eliminate the firing points. The leader of the group of half-demon Taurens listened to his master's orders and immediately conveyed it to every warrior. In addition, Buffett also picked up his machete and was ready to find the right time to personally join the battle. After waiting for a moment, the group of fiend worm that was ordered to perform the devouring ritual swallowed and merged with each other. The first acid mist worm appeared on the battlefield. The giant worm was like an acid mist worm that had been magnified thousands of times. Every muscle on its body was made up of a demon worm, and thousands of twisted and struggling evil faces could be seen on its body, ready to spread pain at any time. Chapter 546. Traction Citadel tore a deep hole in the Devil Legion's front line, allowing Batsu's warriors to attack from both sides. Those high-ranked worms would occasionally launch a counterattack, but the devils dealt with them with ease. That was until the sudden appearance of the giant worms of the acid mist. These enormous worms laid across the path of the new boom town like a continuous mountain range that was very difficult to cross. The Batsu Legion stationed on Traction Citadel naturally would not allow them to launch an attack on the fortress. The 3,200 Hellscream were all aimed at the newly appeared worms of the acid mist, constantly baptizing their bodies with cannon fire, shattering them into pieces. However, these enormous worms were like earthworms. No matter how many pieces they were cut into, each piece would always grow into a smaller derivative. Not only that, these worms were fearless. Even if they were ravaged by cannon fire, they would still continue to attack Traction Citadel. This greatly increased the pressure on the Legion of Devils, and Batsu's warriors began to suffer large losses. Purgatory Creation. Faced with an acid mist worm derivative that was charging towards him, the captain of the barbed devils swung his blade, stabbing it at the ring-shaped sawtooth head of the enemy. At the same time, he also used his innate ability to add the Purgatory Creation ability to his weapon. The blade pierced through the nerve center, and a large amount of body fluid began to spurt out from the triangular wound. This derivative tried to use its strong muscles to seal the wound, but it was useless. As the body fluid flowed out, it could only wither and fall to the ground. Ignite Flame. The captain of the barbed devils took out a badge. This was a magical creation that Keyes had provided to all the captains of the Legion of Devils after mastering the mice energy core. He activated the etch spell, summoning a large amount of flames, and burned this derivative to ashes. This action seemed clean and nimble, but in fact, this was the result of his experience after paying the price of the lives of several of his subordinates. Many low-ranked devils would not be able to deal enough damage in one go against the giant acid worm spawn, so they would be able to resist with their powerful regenerative abilities. They would then be bitten by the worm's sharp teeth and die tragically from the poison. What was even more deadly was that some of the larger derivatives still had the complete body of a demon worm on them. Therefore, they were able to use certain magical abilities that were impossible to guard against. Spells like teleportation, weakening spells, vaporization, and so on, if used properly, could really catch the legion of devils off guard. We can't let those guys fuse into monsters anymore. Staring at the real-time battle situation on the crystal screen, Keyes made up his mind. He raised his hand and tapped twice in the air, issuing the latest order. Release all the golem legions. The target is the fusion location of the monsters. Then, the young blue dragon in human form stood up, took the dragon head warhammer in his hand, and strode out of the door. Shay, who received the order, immediately busied himself to the point that his feet barely touched the ground. In this great battle, this remnant of the Wonder Craftsman played a huge role. If he had not personally operated it, the core engine of Traction City would not have been able to operate at such a high load. Together with the information sent by the spellcasters, Shay used the dynamic coordinate system he had established to accurately anchor the location of each devouring ritual. Then, he accurately calculated the required angle, steam pressure, and other values for the golems to be released. Under his precise control, the golems sealed in the slatted boxes all hit the target locations without exception, delivering an unexpected gift to the demon worms. To ensure that nothing went wrong in this batch of golem legions, in addition to the clockwork golems that were used to command the battlefield, each target location was equipped with several iron golems that were used to attack and defend. When these iron-cast robots stood, they were 4 times the height of ordinary people. When they moved, they had an unstoppable momentum. Just by walking, they would cause the earth to tremble. Each iron golem was wrapped in thick cast-iron armor, holding a greatsword and a shield in its 2 hands. Since the outer shell had been engraved with magic arrays in advance, these strong golems were always surrounded by raging flames. If they were surrounded, these iron golems would also use spitting attacks in addition to physical means. Their bodies were filled with high-pressure liquefied death cloud gas. Once the valve on the surface of their bodies was opened, the gas would escape into the surrounding air. With these war weapons that were good at attacking and defending, and with the command of the clockwork golems, as well as the cooperation of the flesh golems that were not afraid of death and dared to launch suicidal attacks at any time, the failure rate of the demon worms devouring each other and fusing into the acid mist giant worm ritual rapidly increased, greatly reducing the pressure on Traction City. Many demon worms chose to retreat. Originally, under the arrangement of the cataclysmic swarm, they retreated first to establish a defensive position at the rear, but they were attacked from behind. "Get out of the way, don't block my way." "What? I'm afraid you're not running away." A Glabrezu and a Vrak quarreled. The Glabrezu flew into a rage out of humiliation and used its large colisary to send the Vrak flying. Naturally, the Vrak was not to be outdone. The nails on its claws suddenly snapped and flew towards the Glabrezu. At the same time, each nail grew to more than a foot long and pierced the Vrak's body like sharp nails. The Vrak rubbed its fingers, and new nails grew from its fingertips, while the Glabrezu's wounds quickly rotted and festered. The Glabrezu cried out in pain, its eyes burning with flames, and it angrily chanted an incantation. The Vrak that was still proud of itself melted and peeled off like a candle, and its filthy feathers scattered all over the ground. Whoosh! The Glabrezu that was laughing suddenly had an arrow embedded in its majestic back muscles. Its wild laughter came to an abrupt end, and it fell to the ground. Don't waste the demon-hunting spider's venom. A certain person wrapped in an illusion cloak scolded his companions in a low voice. They all wore the same clothes, and in the eyes of the demon worms, they looked like their own kind. The Glabrezu has a permanent spell of truth, the person who obviously played with the bow explained and did not say anything else. However, this explanation was obviously effective, and the person who seemed to be the leader did not continue to scold them. He just gestured for the rest of the team to quickly follow and blend into the retreating demon worms, sneaking towards the enemy's rear. You're tuning into the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.